I had been driving for hours through the winding mountain roads, the sun already dipping low behind the peaks, leaving long, jagged shadows across the narrow lanes. The GPS signal kept cutting in and out, and every now and then the screen would flicker and lose the map completely. I wasn't sure if I was on the right road anymore. The air was crisp, almost biting as I rolled the window down for a moment, letting the wind whip against my face. The trees were thick, ancient, and silent, standing close enough to block the fading light from the road. I had rented a small cabin for a week, thinking it would be the perfect escape, a chance to clear my mind, hike a few trails, and be alone for a while. The cabin was supposed to be remote, but I hadn't expected the roads to get this narrow, twisted, and steep. Every few minutes, I had to slow down almost to a crawl, especially when the road curved sharply around boulders or fallen trees. I passed an old wooden sign that had Raven Creek, barely legible in peeling paint. Beyond that, there were no signs, no markers, just the road curling like a ribbon through the forest. My phone had 1 bar at best, and the temperature gauge on the dashboard dropped as the sun disappeared completely. When I finally saw the cabin, relief hit me. It was a small structure, made of rough-hewn logs, with a metal roof that had begun to rust. A thin trail of smoke curled from the chimney, suggesting it had recently been used. The porch sagged slightly on one side, and I noticed that several boards on the steps were loose, creaking under my weight as I climbed them. The door was old, with iron hinges streaked with rust, but it opened easily when I pushed. Inside, the cabin smelled faintly of wood smoke and damp pine. Dust covered the floor, but it didn't look like anyone had been living there recently. The furniture was basic: a small table, 2 chairs, a bed frame with a thin mattress, and a small wood-burning stove. I put down my bag and went to inspect the stove. There was a stack of firewood in the corner, and some kindling in a box next to it. I struck a match, and after a few tries, a small flame caught. The room warmed quickly, and for a moment, I felt a sense of comfort. I looked around the cabin. The walls were bare except for a single framed photograph, slightly askew. It was of the cabin itself from a long time ago. The image was faded, the wood appearing darker than it did now, and the trees looked younger, smaller. It was odd to see such a picture here, like whoever had lived here wanted a reminder of the place as it once was. After unpacking my things, I decided to go for a short walk to explore the area. There was a small creek nearby, the sound of water trickling over rocks audible even from the porch. I followed the narrow trail down the slope, careful not to slip on the wet leaves. The woods were quiet, but not in a peaceful way. There was a weight to the silence, like the forest was holding its breath. I saw broken branches on the ground, fresh footprints that were too big to be deer, and I realized I was completely alone. My heart sped up slightly, but I told myself it was just the nerves from being in a new place. I returned to the cabin just before darkness fully settled. The sky was a deep, starless black, and the wind made the trees groan and sway. I lit another fire in the stove and sat on the bed, looking out the window at the shadowed forest. That's when I noticed it, a figure moving between the trees. At first, I thought it was a deer or some large animal, but it was upright, and its movement was deliberate. It stopped occasionally, as if watching the cabin. My pulse quickened, but I reminded myself that it could be someone hiking or a hunter. The forest was vast. They would have no reason to linger if they weren't lost. The night passed uneasily. Every crack of a branch, every rustle of leaves, made me tense. I didn't sleep well, jumping at every sound. In the morning, I resolved to explore further, maybe find a trail leading back to a main road. I packed some water, a flashlight, and my map, even though it wasn't much help in this dense forest. The sun was higher now, filtering through the trees in mottled patches of light. I tried to follow the creek upstream, thinking it might lead somewhere familiar. Hours passed. The terrain was tougher than I expected. Steep inclines, fallen trees, and thick underbrush slowed me down. The quiet was oppressive. Birds chirped here and there, but the sound felt distant, as if the forest itself muffled them. At one point, I realized the footprints I had seen last night were still around. Only now they were closer to the cabin and more numerous. My stomach sank. Whoever or whatever had left them wasn't leaving. By late afternoon, I was exhausted, and I still hadn't found a main trail. I turned back toward the cabin, but the woods seemed different, unfamiliar. The sun was already dipping behind the mountains again, and shadows stretched long and dark. The further I walked, the more I realized I might have lost my bearings. Every turn I took seemed to loop back to the same cluster of trees, the same broken branch, the same bend in the creek. I tried to calm myself, telling myself I would find it eventually, that the GPS would pick up again, but I could feel panic rising. Night fell fast, and I was still not at the cabin. I tried to retrace my steps, but in the dark, it was nearly impossible. My flashlight illuminated patches of forest, but shadows between the trees were deep and shifting. Every rustle made me freeze. I could hear branches snapping, leaves crunching under some unseen weight. I kept moving, trying not to think, trying to stay calm. But I knew someone or something was following me. Hours later, exhausted, I stumbled into a small clearing and saw the cabin in the distance. Relief washed over me, but it was tempered by fear. The figure I had seen yesterday night was on the porch, faintly visible in the dim light of the stove inside. It hadn't moved. My mind raced. I considered running, hiding, but the figure stayed still. I decided to approach slowly, my hand on the axe I had carried with me from the car, just in case. I had been driving all day, the tires of my old sedan crunching over gravel roads that wound through dense forest. My destination was a small, isolated cabin that I had rented for a week. It was supposed to be a chance to get away, to escape the constant pressure of work, the noise of the city, the endless demands of emails and deadlines. I didn't know exactly what drew me there. Maybe the idea of solitude, maybe just the hope that being somewhere remote would let me think without interruption. The forest around me was thick and green, the trees tall enough that sunlight barely touched the ground. Birds and small animals occasionally darted across the road, making me slow down. The cabin itself was hidden from view until I rounded the final bend. It was small, made of dark-stained logs, with a pitched roof and a chimney that looked like it hadn't been used in a while. A narrow dirt driveway led to it, overgrown with grass. I parked the car next to the cabin, stepped out, and felt the chill in the air. Even though it was late spring, the forest kept the place cool. I grabbed my bag and walked up to the door, noticing that the windows were dusty, the wood slightly warped. It didn't feel abandoned exactly, but it had the sort of quiet that was almost too deep, the kind that made you feel very aware of every sound you made. Inside, the cabin was small but functional. There was a single main room with a table, a few chairs, a small wood stove, and a couch that looked like it had been used more than once over the years. A narrow hallway led to a bedroom and a bathroom. Everything smelled faintly of wood and old pine, a little musty, but not unpleasant. I set my things down, unpacked a few necessities, and then sat on the couch, staring out the window at the trees. The light was fading, the shadows stretching long across the forest floor. I spent the evening preparing dinner on the small stove, trying to enjoy the quiet. I had brought simple food, canned soup, bread, a few vegetables. The wind rustled the leaves outside, and at one point I thought I heard something that sounded like a branch snapping. I paused and listened, but the noise didn't repeat, so I shook my head and told myself it was just my imagination. As night fell, I built a small fire in the stove. The room glowed softly, casting shadows on the walls. I sat there for a long time, staring at the flames, feeling the stillness of the forest pressing against the cabin. At first, it was comforting, the way quiet can be when it's controlled and contained. But after a while, it started to feel oppressive. Every little creak of the floorboards, every rustle outside, sounded amplified. My mind, unused to such isolation, started to fill in sounds, giving them shape and meaning that wasn't there. The first night was difficult. I woke up repeatedly, certain I had heard someone or something moving outside. I convinced myself it was just the wind or a small animal, but sleep came in short bursts. The next morning, I felt drained. I made coffee, ate some bread, and tried to shake off the tension that had built up overnight. I decided to go for a walk in the forest to clear my head. The trail behind the cabin was narrow and winding, overgrown in some places. The forest was dense, and sunlight barely broke through the canopy. As I walked, I felt both exhilarated and uneasy. The isolation was complete. There were no other sounds besides birds and the occasional rustle of small animals. I tried to focus on the beauty around me, the texture of tree bark, the way the light fell in patches, the smell of damp earth, but my mind kept returning to the feeling from last night that I was being watched. It wasn't until I had been walking for over an hour that I realized I had lost track of the trail. I looked back, trying to remember where I had come from, but every tree looked the same. Panic started to rise. I had my phone with me, but there was no signal. I took a deep breath and decided to retrace my steps carefully, marking trees and rocks to help me find my way. The sun was starting to dip, and shadows lengthened, making it even harder to recognize landmarks. After what felt like hours, I finally stumbled back onto the main path, relieved but shaken. When I returned to the cabin, I noticed that the front door was slightly ajar. I was certain I had locked it. My heart pounded as I approached, but there was no sign of forced entry. Everything inside looked untouched. I double-checked the locks and then sat down, trying to convince myself I had just forgotten. But the sense of unease lingered, thicker than before. Over the next few days, the feeling grew. Small things began to unsettle me. The sound of something scraping against the outside wall at night, footsteps in the snow outside when I was certain I was alone, shadows that didn't match the trees outside. I started keeping a knife close by, more for my own reassurance than any real threat. Every noise made me tense. Every glance out the window made me jump. I was hyper-aware of my surroundings in a way that left me exhausted by nightfall. One afternoon, I decided to explore further from the cabin to see if there was any sign of other people. I walked along a narrow creek, its water running clear and cold, over rocks and fallen branches. The sound of the water was soothing at first, but soon I noticed signs that made my stomach twist. Footprints in the mud that weren't mine, broken branches that looked deliberately snapped. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe hunters, maybe hikers. But the more I walked, the less comfortable I felt. By evening, I had returned to the cabin, tense and on edge. I decided to take precautions. I moved furniture to block windows, double-checked the doors, and set up a small makeshift alarm system using cans and string, an idea I had read about for camping in bear country. It was absurd, but it made me feel safer. That night, I slept fitfully, waking at every little sound. Then, one night, I heard the most alarming noise yet. Something heavy moving just outside the cabin, close to the door. It wasn't a small animal. I froze, heart racing, waiting to see if it would repeat. Then I heard a low thud, like something had hit the wall. I realized the only way to know what it was would be to confront it, but I felt paralyzed with fear. After what felt like hours, the noise stopped. I waited until dawn, still awake, listening, imagining every possible scenario. In the morning, I went outside cautiously. There were no footprints, no sign of entry, nothing. It was as if whatever had been there had vanished. The fear and tension that had built up over the previous days began to take a toll on me. I realized I couldn't continue like this. I packed my things quickly, leaving half of what I had brought behind. As I drove away, the forest stretching endlessly on either side, I reflected on the experience. The fear I had felt wasn't caused by anything supernatural. It was the isolation, the unfamiliarity, the fact that my senses were heightened in a way that made every normal noise seem threatening. The forest didn't have to hide monsters. My own mind had done more than enough. I felt a strange mixture of relief and disappointment. Relief that I was leaving, disappointment that I had let fear dominate my experience. By the time I reached the main road, civilization returning in the form of houses, cars, and people, I felt a sense of clarity. Being alone in the forest had shown me how fragile my sense of safety really was, how easily fear could control perception. But it had also taught me something important. Preparation and caution could keep me safe, even in situations that seemed overwhelming. I had survived, and I was stronger for it. Looking back now, I see the cabin not as a place of terror, but as a test of patience, resilience, and awareness. The forest is indifferent. It doesn't seek to harm, but it demands respect. I returned home, grateful for the ordinary, predictable world I had left behind, but also proud of the way I had handled myself in the quiet, tense solitude. I had faced the fear of being completely alone and emerged with not only my life intact, but with a deeper understanding of my own limits and the way the human mind responds to uncertainty. That experience stayed with me. In the weeks that followed, I often thought about the cabin, the creaking floors, the shadows outside the window, and the strange feeling of being watched when no one was there. But rather than dread, I now felt a sense of accomplishment. I had confronted fear in its rawest, most realistic form. There were no ghosts, no curses, no fairy tale monsters. Just me, my mind, and the forest. And in facing it, I had found clarity, resilience, and a strange, lasting peace. I had been driving for hours along a thin, twisting road that wound through dense pine forests and steep hills. The sun had already begun to sink behind the trees when I finally turned onto a gravel path that led to the cabin. It was one of those roads where every mile felt slower, the tires crunching over gravel in a way that made the isolation around me even more obvious. By the time I reached the cabin, darkness had crept into the sky, and the forest around me seemed to close in like a wall. I parked my car at the edge of a small clearing, stepped out, and felt the immediate chill of the evening air. It smelled of wet earth and pine needles, sharp and almost suffocating in its density. The cabin itself was small, old, and wooden, with paint peeling from the walls and a roof that looked like it had seen far too many winters. There was a thin layer of moss creeping along the edges of the shingles, and the windows were dark and reflective. I could see my own face in them, and for a moment, it felt like the only proof that I was really there. The porch sagged slightly under the weight of years, and as I stepped onto it, I had to be careful with each footfall, making sure not to misstep. The door groaned loudly when I opened it, the sound echoing far into the surrounding forest. Inside, the cabin smelled of damp wood, dust, and something older, something that wasn't immediately identifiable but made the hair on the back of my neck rise. The interior was sparse. A small kitchen was against one wall, with a rusted stove and a sink that had clearly not seen proper cleaning in months. A wooden table with uneven legs occupied the center of the room, and a single chair sat at its side, wobbling slightly when I leaned on it. Across from the kitchen was a small living area, with a threadbare couch and an old rug. The cabin was mostly empty, almost sterile in its lack of personal touches, and it gave me an uneasy sense that I was intruding into a space that had been abandoned but not entirely forgotten. I unpacked a small bag, setting it on the table, and tried to settle in. I knew I would be alone for the next 3 days. The plan had been to escape the city, escape people, escape noise. I thought about the forest stretching endlessly beyond the cabin, the tall, dark trees, the silence that would press down on me like a weight. I thought about how this place would make me feel free, alone, but I hadn't anticipated how oppressive the isolation would feel in the dark. Night came fast, the kind of night that wraps itself around everything, so thick that the forest disappears into a solid black wall. I lit a small lamp in the corner, a weak circle of light that barely reached the walls. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the cabin slightly, shaking loose the branches of the nearby trees. I could hear them scrape against each other, an irregular tapping and scratching, and the sound made me uneasy in a way I could not explain. I reminded myself that it was just wind, just trees, nothing more. Still, I felt the tension coil in my chest. I tried to distract myself. I made some tea over the old stove, the water sputtering and hissing, filling the cabin with steam and the faint smell of iron from the kettle. I sat at the table, watching the light flicker across the walls, noticing every small imperfection in the wood, every crack and stain that seemed to have its own history. It was hard not to imagine someone having lived there, someone who had left in a hurry or someone who had stayed too long. Shadows moved oddly in the corners, and every small noise, the wind through the cracks in the walls, the creak of the floorboards as the cabin settled, made me tense. Around midnight, I decided to check the windows. I approached the largest one in the living area and pulled back the thin curtain. The forest was a solid black mass outside, but I thought I could see movement. At first, I told myself it was a trick of the light, the branches swaying in the wind, shadows forming shapes that my mind wanted to fill in. But then I noticed something. A faint figure standing beyond the tree line, motionless, just barely visible in the dim moonlight. My heart started to race. I leaned closer, squinting, trying to make out what it was. And then it moved, not running, not walking, but slowly shifting its position, maintaining distance, but following the cabin. I stepped back from the window. My first thought was that it was someone lost in the forest, maybe another camper. But the way it moved, deliberate yet distant, gave me a deep sense of unease. I tried to convince myself it was nothing. The forest was full of animals. Maybe it was a deer or a moose, and the shadows were playing tricks. I went to bed, keeping the lamp on, but I did not sleep. Every sound, the tapping of branches, the groan of the cabin, made me jump. Every shadow seemed to take shape, moving closer. Morning brought relief in some ways. Light spilled through the windows, washing away some of the darkness and shadows that had pressed so heavily on me during the night. I stepped outside, breathing in cold, clean air. The forest looked peaceful, ordinary, even inviting. But as I walked around the cabin, I noticed footprints in the dirt. They were fresh, human, leading from the tree line toward the cabin, then stopping abruptly at the edge of the clearing. My stomach sank. Whoever had been out there had been close, very close to the cabin itself. I checked the doors and windows again. Everything was locked, intact. There was no sign of forced entry, nothing stolen. I spent the day trying to keep busy. I collected firewood, cleaned the cabin a little, explored the area. I forced myself to focus on ordinary tasks, trying to push down the gnawing sense of being watched. The forest looked normal in the daylight, but at the edges of my vision, I kept seeing movement, figures that vanished when I turned my head. I told myself again it was nerves, imagination, paranoia. The second night was worse. The figure returned, or maybe there was more than one now. I saw movement near the trees, figures shifting at the edge of the clearing, staying just out of reach. I could hear whispers carried by the wind, indistinct but unmistakably human. Every time I tried to sleep, I felt eyes on me, felt the weight of someone, or several someones, watching from the darkness. I refused to leave the cabin, barricaded the doors with old furniture, and kept the lights on, but still the sounds came. Every floorboard creak, every branch snap, every rustle in the trees felt amplified, like it was happening just outside my walls. By the third day, I had resolved to leave. I packed quickly, trying not to draw attention to myself. But when I opened the door, the footprints were everywhere. Not just the edge of the clearing, but circling the cabin, some leading toward the trees, some toward the cabin itself, as if the forest had been crawling around me while I slept. I got into the car, heart racing, constantly glancing into the shadows around the clearing. As I drove away, I thought I saw figures standing among the trees, thin and motionless, watching me retreat. Eventually, I reached the main road and the sense of being followed began to fade. I called the local authorities once I got cell service, explaining what I had seen, but they told me nothing unusual had been reported. I kept thinking about the cabin, the forest, the footprints, and the shadows. It was not fairy tale ghosts or monsters, just people lost or dangerous, but the fear I felt was real. I later learned that the area had been a site for squatters and travelers who avoided towns, people who moved silently in the forests and rarely showed themselves during the day. That knowledge explained much, but it did not erase the memory. Even now, I remember the smell of the damp cabin, the creak of the floorboards, the shapes moving in the dark, and the constant, terrifying awareness of being watched. I never returned, and I do not plan to, but the experience changed how I think about isolation. The forest is quiet, but that quiet can be a warning in itself. a signal that humans are not the only ones who might be waiting in the darkness, and that sometimes the most frightening things are very real, very ordinary, and very close. I drove through the winding mountain roads, the tires crunching over loose gravel and patches of dirt that had been scattered across the asphalt from recent rains. It was late afternoon, the sun hanging low in the sky, filtering through the tall pines that lined the road. The air was crisp, with a faint scent of wet earth and decaying leaves, and as I rounded a bend, I saw the cabin. It was older than I expected, a wooden structure with faded brown siding and a roof dotted with dark patches of moss. I had rented it online on a whim, attracted by the promise of complete solitude for a weekend, a place where I could write and disconnect from the noise of the city. Now, as I stepped out of my car, I realized that solitude came with a price. The silence was thick, almost tangible, pressing against me like a living thing. The cabin's front porch was narrow and sagging slightly in the middle. I ran my hand along the rough railing and felt the cold, damp wood beneath my fingers. The air was chilly, sharper than I had expected for this time of year, and I shivered as I unlocked the door. It opened with a long creak, and I stepped inside, immediately greeted by a smell of old wood, dust, and something faintly metallic that I could not identify. I dropped my bags on the floor and took in the interior. It was small, with a single room that combined the kitchen, living area, and sleeping space. The furniture was simple and functional, old but solid. A wooden table with 2 chairs, a small wood stove in the corner, and a bed with a thin mattress that looked like it had seen decades of use. The windows were thick, and the glass rippled slightly, distorting the view of the forest outside. As I moved through the cabin, I noticed small details that added to the sense of unease. A chipped mug in the cupboard, a faint stain on the floorboards, scratches on the walls near the doorway. These were things that could be explained by normal wear and tear, but in that silence, they felt like signs that I was not entirely alone, or that the place had a history I could not see. I decided to start a fire in the stove. The wood stacked beside it was dry, and the smell of it burning filled the cabin quickly, warming the small room. The light from the flames flickered across the walls, casting shadows that seemed to shift when I wasn't looking directly at them. I tried to focus on something mundane to calm myself, so I opened my laptop and began to type. The keyboard clicked steadily, but soon I realized that the quiet was not natural. It was so complete that even the sound of my own breathing was amplified. Every crack of the fire, every groan of the cabin settling, sounded like movement around me. As evening deepened, I prepared a simple meal. Canned beans heated on the stove, bread, and a small bottle of water. I ate quickly, listening intently to the forest outside. There was no wind, no birds, just a faint rustling, subtle but persistent. At first, I assumed it was an animal, a deer, perhaps moving through the underbrush. But the more I listened, the more I noticed that the sound was inconsistent. It moved in ways that didn't make sense for a normal forest animal, almost deliberate, circling the cabin. My stomach tightened, and I realized that I had no cell service. My phone displayed no signal in small, unblinking letters. I was completely cut off. I tried to convince myself it was nothing. It had to be an animal. Yet every instinct in me told me that this place, though ordinary in appearance, carried a weight I could not define. The night fell fully, dark and absolute. I pulled a blanket over my shoulders and tried to read, but my eyes kept darting to the windows. Shapes seemed to move in the blackness outside, just at the edge of my vision, always retreating when I tried to look directly. I shook my head, telling myself that I was imagining things, that the isolation and the silence were playing tricks on me. Sleep was elusive. Every creak of the cabin, every whisper of movement outside, made me jump. Around 2 in the morning, I finally drifted into a shallow sleep, only to be woken by a loud bang. It came from the back of the cabin, a single, heavy thump that made me sit up with my heart hammering. My first thought was that something had fallen inside, perhaps the stove or firewood, but everything appeared intact. I grabbed a flashlight and went to check, moving slowly so as not to trip over anything. The beam of light cut through the room, illuminating the walls, the floor, the furniture. Nothing seemed out of place. I even checked the doors and windows; they were locked secure. The sound had to be outside. I forced myself to calm down. I reminded myself that I had seen deer tracks near the cabin, and the forest was full of wildlife. A large animal could have struck a fallen branch against the cabin. I tried to lie down again, keeping the flashlight close, but I could not stop my ears from straining toward the shadows outside. Every sound felt magnified, every movement a potential threat. I dozed in fits and starts, waking repeatedly to noises that could not be explained. By the time dawn approached, I was exhausted, jittery, and tense, the silence of the night leaving a ringing in my head. Morning light revealed nothing unusual outside. The forest was still and quiet, sunbeams piercing through the canopy, illuminating patches of moss and the wet, glistening ground. I made coffee and tried to plan my day, telling myself I would go for a walk in the woods to calm down. I packed a small bag with water, snacks, and my phone, even though it had no signal. As I stepped outside, I noticed something odd. The ground around the cabin was undisturbed, except for a set of footprints leading away from the back door. They were too large for a deer, too deliberate, human in shape, but they did not lead anywhere familiar. They disappeared into the trees, leaving me frozen, unsure if I should follow or retreat. I returned inside and decided to reinforce the doors and windows. I wedged a chair against the back door and checked the locks repeatedly. My mind raced with possibilities, each one more disturbing than the last. Was someone watching the cabin? Had they been here last night? The idea that someone had approached in the darkness, unseen, terrified me. I searched the cabin for anything I could use for protection: an old axe by the stove, a kitchen knife, a small hammer. None of it was ideal, but it would have to do. The next hours were tense and exhausting. Every time I went near a window, I saw movement at the edge of the forest. I tried to focus on writing, to distract myself with the laptop, but I could not concentrate. My eyes kept drifting to the shadows, my mind imagining all sorts of scenarios. As night approached again, the anxiety became almost unbearable. I could not tell if I was being hunted, or if the forest itself had become a threat. Every sound amplified in my imagination. I decided I could not stay another night. I needed to leave before something happened. I packed quickly, grabbing my essentials, flashlight, and phone. I locked the cabin and stepped outside. The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of red and orange. The forest looked ordinary, peaceful, but I knew better now. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a branch, seemed like a potential threat. I moved carefully, following the road back toward where I had parked the car. My heart pounded, adrenaline pumping through my body. Halfway down the path, I saw them. Footprints again, fresh, human, following mine, but at a distance. My stomach dropped, and I ran, glancing over my shoulder. The forest was dense, and shadows moved quickly, making it hard to see. My legs burned, lungs gasping for air. As I reached the car, I fumbled with the keys, finally unlocking the door and throwing myself inside. I started the engine, tires spinning on the gravel, and drove away without looking back. The forest receded, and eventually, the sense of being hunted faded, though my body remained tense for hours. I reported the footprints to the local ranger office the next day, describing everything I had experienced. They took notes but said there was no evidence of anyone being at the cabin recently, aside from normal wildlife activity. They advised caution and suggested I choose more populated areas in the future. I understood, but I knew what I had felt. The sensation of being watched, the deliberate pattern of footsteps, the unnatural sounds of the forest. It had been real even if no one else could see it. In the weeks that followed, I avoided that part of the forest entirely. I kept thinking about the cabin, about the emptiness and the strange weight of the silence, and about how quickly isolation could turn into fear. I realized that being alone in nature was not inherently dangerous, but the combination of isolation, darkness, and the unknown could become terrifying very quickly. I also realized that I had survived by staying alert, trusting my instincts, and acting decisively. Fear could be paralyzing, but awareness and action could save you. The memory of that weekend remains vivid. The sight of the sagging porch, the smell of old wood and fire, the feeling of footsteps following mine, and the absolute stillness of the forest at night. All of it. I remember the first time I decided to spend a weekend alone at the cabin, far out in the woods. I had been driving for hours on narrow, winding roads that seemed to stretch forever, lined with dense forests on both sides. The kind of forest where the trees are so close together that sunlight barely reaches the ground. I had wanted to escape the city, escape the constant hum of traffic and people, and find a place where I could just exist with nothing but silence and my own thoughts. My parents' old cabin had been passed down to me a few years ago, but I had never had the courage, or perhaps the time, to spend an extended period alone there. That weekend, I finally decided it was time. The drive had been long, but I had anticipated it. My car was packed with supplies. Enough food to last me the weekend, water, a first aid kit, extra blankets, and some firewood I had bought from a gas station a few miles back. The last few miles were rough. The road deteriorated into gravel, then mud, then an almost forgotten dirt path lined with fallen leaves and broken branches. I had to maneuver carefully around large potholes that threatened to swallow the tires whole. Every now and then, I passed trees that had fallen across the path, forcing me to slow down and either drive around them or carefully climb over smaller logs. The forest was quiet except for the occasional sound of birds or the distant hum of a car far away, which quickly disappeared into the trees. When I finally arrived at the cabin, the sun was low in the sky. The cabin itself was small, old, and made entirely of dark wood that had weathered decades of harsh winters and long, humid summers. The windows were dusty, and the front porch creaked under my weight as I stepped inside. The smell hit me immediately. A mix of damp wood, old smoke from the fireplace, and something earthy that I couldn't quite place. I had cleaned the cabin once before, during a summer visit years ago, but the smell had returned as if the walls had absorbed it over time and were now exhaling it again. The inside was modest. There was a small kitchen with a wood-burning stove, a table with 2 chairs, and shelves filled with old pots, pans, and canned goods. A narrow staircase led to a loft that had a bed covered with a thick quilt. The floorboards creaked under every step, reminding me that this cabin had stood for many decades without much repair. I placed my backpack down and went straight to the fireplace. I wanted to light a fire, to push back the early darkness and the chill that seemed to seep through the wooden walls. The fire was small at first, but the warmth slowly spread through the room, and the smell of burning wood filled the air. I spent the first hour unpacking, organizing my supplies, and making the space livable. I had planned to go for a short walk in the nearby woods before nightfall, but as I stepped outside, the sun was almost gone. The forest was alive with sounds I had never paid attention to before. The rustling of leaves, the distant snap of a twig, the scurrying of small animals. The shadows grew longer, and the air felt colder than it had in the city. There was a quiet tension in the way the trees leaned over the path, as if they were watching me. I tried to shake the feeling and reminded myself that I was alone because I wanted to be, that no one was here to harm me. Night fell quickly. By the time I returned to the cabin, it was completely dark, the kind of darkness that swallows everything, leaving only shapes and shadows. I ate a simple dinner, drank some water, and sat near the fireplace. The firelight cast flickering shadows on the walls, and I found myself staring into the flames longer than I intended. Every so often, I thought I heard something outside, but the wind was strong, and the trees groaned under its weight. I told myself it was just the forest settling, just the wind, but the sense of being watched lingered. I went to bed earlier than usual. The loft was smaller than I remembered, and the mattress was firmer than I liked, but I was exhausted. I covered myself with the quilt, feeling the warmth of the fire still radiating through the wooden floorboards. The wind outside had picked up, and the sound of it made the cabin creak in ways I hadn't noticed during the day. At first, I slept lightly, my dreams filled with vague shadows moving through trees. I woke a few times to noises, branches snapping, the distant howl of some animal. But I drifted back to sleep, telling myself it was normal in the woods. Around 3 in the morning, I woke suddenly. The wind had died down, and the forest outside was eerily silent. The kind of silence that makes your own breathing sound deafening. I could hear the faint tapping of something against the window. At first, I thought it was a branch, but it came again, slower, deliberate. My heart began to race. I told myself it had to be a branch or perhaps an animal, but I couldn't see anything outside. The darkness pressed against the windows, and I felt trapped in the small cabin. I stayed in bed, trying to calm myself, but sleep was impossible now. Every little noise made me jump. The floorboards creaking, the wind brushing against the walls, the occasional scurry of some creature outside. I got up and walked to the kitchen to check the doors and windows. Everything was locked, but the sense of unease didn't leave me. I tried to distract myself by checking my supplies and reorganizing a few things, but the silence of the forest had a weight that made every small sound feel like a threat. Then I heard it, the unmistakable sound of footsteps on the porch. Slow, careful, deliberate. I froze. My mind raced. I had no phone signal, no way to call for help. The cabin was isolated, miles from any road or neighbor. Whoever it was could be anywhere outside, hiding in the shadows of the trees. My stomach tightened, and I tried to think rationally. Maybe it was a hunter or perhaps someone else with access to the cabin, but the thought offered little comfort. I grabbed a heavy cast iron pan from the stove and crept to the door, listening. The footsteps had stopped. My heart pounded so loudly I was sure they could hear it if they were outside. I looked through the window. Nothing. The porch was empty. The forest stretched out before me, black and silent. I considered opening the door, calling out, but the thought of stepping outside into that darkness was unbearable. I spent the rest of the night sitting near the fireplace, pan in hand, barely moving, barely breathing. Every shadow seemed alive, every sound amplified. Morning felt like it would never come, but eventually, light broke through the windows. The forest was calm, as if nothing had happened, and I felt a small sense of relief. During the day, I explored the area around the cabin. I walked the narrow paths, noted landmarks, and looked for signs of anyone else being nearby. There were no tracks, no evidence of human presence, only the signs of animals, rabbits, deer, and the occasional fox. I began to convince myself that it had all been my imagination, the stress and isolation playing tricks on my mind. The next night, I was more prepared. I reinforced the doors, stacked more firewood near the fireplace, and set up makeshift barriers to make the cabin feel more secure. But the fear hadn't left me completely. Every night, I stayed alert, listening to the sounds outside, imagining what could be lurking in the darkness. I slept in short bursts, waking at every small sound, every unexpected creak. On the third night, the cabin door shook violently. I was lying on the bed in the loft when I heard the sound, a hard, insistent banging. My first thought was panic. I grabbed the pan again, my hands shaking. I had no idea who or what was outside, but the force behind the door suggested someone, or something was strong enough to break it down. I backed into a corner, trying to stay out of sight. The door rattled again, then silence. Hours passed. I didn't move until the sun began to rise, and even then, I waited another hour before venturing out. Outside, there were no footprints, no signs of forced entry, nothing. It was as if the event had never happened. The air smelled of damp earth and wood smoke, the forest calm and normal. I was exhausted, both physically and mentally, and I realized that I couldn't stay here much longer. My sense of safety had been destroyed, and the isolation that once felt peaceful now felt suffocating. I packed up my supplies quickly, my hands trembling. I loaded my car, checking the windows and locks one last time before driving away. As I turned onto the gravel road, I glanced back at the cabin. It stood silently among the trees, unchanged, but to me, it no longer felt like a refuge. The forest, once inviting, now seemed menacing. The experience had left a mark. I never returned to the cabin. I sold it the following year, unable to shake the memories of those nights. Even now, when I think about it, I remember the crushing sense of fear, the oppressive silence of the forest, and the inexplicable pounding on the door. I am certain that no one had been there, yet the fear was real and the threat had felt real. I carry that memory with me, a reminder of how thin the veil of safety can be, and how quickly isolation and the unknown can turn a peaceful retreat into a nightmare. I never imagined that a simple weekend trip could turn into something so unsettling. I had been looking forward to a quiet retreat in the woods for weeks. The past few months had been exhausting. My job required me to sit at a desk for long hours, staring at screens and handling endless emails. I needed silence, isolation, and the chance to breathe. The cabin I rented was advertised as remote, off the grid, surrounded by thick forests and miles away from the nearest town. It was supposed to be perfect for disconnecting. The drive to the cabin was long, stretching over winding roads that cut through dense pine forests. The air smelled fresh and clean, carrying a hint of damp earth and the faint scent of moss growing on the trunks of trees. As I drove, the sunlight started to dip behind the trees, casting long shadows across the narrow road. My anticipation grew. I kept imagining the cabin sitting in a clearing, with a small wooden porch and a fire pit outside. When I finally arrived, the cabin looked even better than the pictures. It was a small, wooden structure with weathered brown walls and a roof covered with dark shingles. Smoke curled lazily from the stone chimney, suggesting that someone had been there recently. I parked the car in a rough gravel area nearby and stepped out. The air was colder than I expected, sharp and crisp. Birds chirped faintly, hidden somewhere among the tall trees. I felt a strange mix of relief and excitement, but as I stood there looking at the cabin, I noticed a silence that felt heavier than normal. There was no rustling of leaves, no distant sound of cars, no human voices, just the quiet hum of the forest. I unlocked the door and stepped inside. The interior smelled faintly of wood polish and old pine, mixed with a musty undertone that made me wrinkle my nose. The cabin was small but well maintained. A simple living area opened up to a kitchen with a stove and a few basic utensils. A narrow staircase led up to a loft where the sleeping area was. I walked through slowly, letting my eyes adjust to the dim light coming in from the windows. Everything was neat, almost too neat, as if someone had prepared the place for me but had not yet left. I set down my bag and began unpacking, arranging my clothes and supplies. Outside, the sun was dipping lower, and shadows stretched across the clearing, wrapping the cabin in an uneasy half-light. I decided to take a short walk to explore the surrounding area. The forest was thick, with tall pine trees that blocked most of the remaining sunlight. Fallen branches crunched under my feet, and the occasional rustle of small animals added to the tense atmosphere. It was beautiful, but there was a sense of isolation that made me acutely aware of how alone I really was. After a while, I returned to the cabin, feeling a mixture of satisfaction and unease. The air had grown colder, and the wind whispered through the trees, bending branches and carrying a strange, dry sound. I built a small fire in the stone fireplace, sitting back to watch the flames crackle. The light flickered across the wooden walls, casting long, shifting shadows that seemed to stretch and move as the fire grew. I felt a tightness in my chest, a quiet awareness that this place was remote in every sense, far from help, far from anyone else. Night fell fully, and the darkness outside became thick and impenetrable. I went to the loft to sleep, but the quiet was oppressive. Every sound seemed amplified. The creak of the cabin settling, the wind scratching against the trees, the occasional thump of something hitting the roof. It all felt too loud in the stillness. I tried to push it aside, reminding myself that I was safe and that I had prepared for this isolation. I eventually drifted off to a restless sleep, tossing and turning, hearing things I knew were probably just the forest, but feeling unnerved nonetheless. I woke early, before sunrise, to the sound of heavy footsteps outside. At first, I thought it was an animal, maybe a deer or a bear moving through the underbrush. But then the footsteps became more deliberate, heavier, moving closer to the cabin. I froze, my heart racing. I couldn't see anything from the loft windows, only the darkness of the forest. The steps stopped for a moment, and then I heard a faint scraping noise, like someone dragging something across the ground. My mind raced. No one else should be here. The cabin was miles from the nearest road. I grabbed a flashlight and quietly descended the stairs, my pulse hammering in my ears. I crept to the door and peered outside. There was no one there, but the ground was disturbed, small footprints leading away from the cabin and back into the trees. They were not animal tracks, they were human. I stepped outside, shining the flashlight across the clearing. The forest seemed endless, dark, and empty, but those footprints suggested that someone had been close. I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the cold. I spent the rest of the day on edge. I tried to ignore the unease, focusing on small tasks inside the cabin, chopping wood, checking my supplies, making sure everything was in order. But at every sound, I jumped. A branch snapping outside, the distant call of a bird, the wind pushing through the trees. It all set my nerves on edge. I avoided looking out the windows, though I could not stop myself from glancing now and then. I began to notice subtle signs that someone else had been near the cabin recently. A broken branch near the fire pit, footprints leading to the edge of the clearing, a faint disturbance in the gravel where I had parked my car. As night fell again, I made sure the door was locked and the windows secured. I kept a knife on the table beside me and sat close to the fire. The forest outside grew darker, almost solid black, and the wind rose, moving through the trees with a low, mournful sound. I heard movement, soft and irregular, like someone circling the cabin, stopping, then moving again. I held my breath, straining to see. The flashlight illuminated nothing but the trees. I told myself I was imagining things, that it was the wind, but the feeling of being watched would not leave me. I did not sleep much that night. Every sound outside made me tense, ready to react. I imagined someone stepping into the clearing, watching me, waiting for the right moment. Morning came slowly. The forest was still dark and cold, but at least daylight offered a sense of safety. I decided I had to leave even though it was early. I packed my things quickly, trying not to make noise. As I loaded my bag into the car, I noticed something that made my stomach turn. More footprints leading away from the cabin, smaller than mine, fresh in the gravel. Someone had been there while I was inside, possibly even while I was sleeping. I drove away as quickly as the narrow, winding roads would allow, eyes scanning the trees, imagining movement behind every trunk. I did not stop until I reached the main road, and even then, I felt like I was still being followed. The sense of unease did not fade as I returned home. I thought about what had happened and realized that the cabin had been perfect in every way, except for the fact that it was isolated and vulnerable. Someone could have been observing me for hours without me knowing. I had been lucky this time. A few days later, I contacted the rental company to report what I had found. They confirmed that no one else should have been on the property and that no other renters had been scheduled for that week. They seemed concerned but unable to explain it. I considered reporting it to the police, but there was little they could do without evidence beyond my story. The thought of someone trespassing in such a remote location was frightening, and I realized how easy it would have been for them to harm me without anyone knowing. Over time, I began to process the experience. I started to understand how important preparation and awareness were, and how quickly a peaceful getaway could turn into a dangerous situation. I learned to respect the isolation and the unknowns that come with it. I also realized the value of small precautions. Carrying a weapon for protection, keeping communication devices charged, letting someone know where I was going. I could not change what had happened, but I could learn from it. I returned to the cabin a month later, but this time during the day with a friend and proper precautions. We explored the area together, walking the forest trails and inspecting the cabin. Everything seemed normal and I felt a sense of closure. The footprints were gone, the disturbances had disappeared, and the cabin was once again just a peaceful retreat. I stayed vigilant, but the fear that had consumed me on that first visit was replaced with a calm respect for the environment and a cautious enjoyment of its solitude. Looking back, I realized that the scariest part was not the darkness, the silence, or the isolation. It was the knowledge that someone had been there without my knowing. That awareness stayed with me long after I left the cabin. It taught me to trust my instincts, to be prepared, and to recognize that danger does not always come in obvious forms. Sometimes it is hidden in quiet footsteps, in the subtle signs around us, waiting for a moment to emerge. I never returned to the cabin alone after that. I still go to the woods, but I do so with caution, respect, and an understanding of how fragile safety can be in a place that feels I had been driving for hours, the kind of drive where the trees begin to close in on both sides of the road and the air smells different, heavier somehow. I wasn't in a hurry. I had planned a week at a small cabin I had found online, tucked deep in the mountains, far from cell service, far from anyone I knew. It promised isolation and quiet, something I had craved for months after the constant noise and stress of city life. The GPS stopped working halfway through the forested area, and I found myself relying on the little printed directions I had brought, checking each turn with an anxious sort of care, knowing that if I missed one, I could easily get lost. The sun was starting to dip low behind the pines, sending long shadows across the dirt road, and I had that creeping feeling that the forest was watching me as I drove. It was just trees, just birds, maybe a squirrel or two. I told myself that over and over, but the feeling wouldn't leave. Eventually, the cabin appeared. It was older than I had expected from the photos. The wood was dark, streaked by years of weather. The roof sagged slightly in the middle, and the porch was uneven, creaking under the weight of a few small steps. Still, it had the charm I was looking for: remote, quiet, and surrounded entirely by thick forest. I parked the car and got out, the gravel crunching beneath my boots. The air was colder than I expected for early autumn, sharp enough to make my lungs sting slightly with each breath. I dragged my bags across the porch, the old wooden boards shifting beneath my weight. Inside, the cabin smelled faintly of damp wood, dust, and something else, something that reminded me of old soil and mildew. The windows were grimy, but the sunlight filtering through them gave the place a golden warmth. It looked like no one had stayed here for weeks, maybe months. That made me both nervous and excited. Finally, a place entirely to myself. The cabin was small but functional. A single bedroom, a bathroom with a shower that looked like it hadn't been used in a while, and a living area with a wood stove and a table. The kitchen had a few shelves, a small fridge, and a propane stove. Everything was dusty, but clean enough that I didn't hesitate to start unpacking. I made a mental note to be careful with the stove. I had read reviews online that said the previous visitors had mentioned a weird smell of gas sometimes. I didn't notice any leaks, but I made sure to open the windows and let the air circulate anyway. After unpacking, I decided to explore the surroundings before the sun fully set. There was a small clearing around the cabin, maybe 30 yards wide. Then the forest closed in tightly on all sides. The trees were thick, mostly pines and some maples. Their branches tangled in ways that made the forest floor dark and uneven. I wandered along what appeared to be a faint trail leading away from the cabin. It was overgrown, almost hidden, but still visible. As I walked, I kept noticing small things: broken branches lying in odd patterns, footprints that didn't match any animal I could think of, the occasional rustle in the underbrush. I kept telling myself it was just deer or raccoons, maybe a fox. Still, the forest felt heavier, quieter the deeper I went. The birds had stopped singing, and even the wind seemed muffled by the thick walls of trees. I didn't have a flashlight with me yet, and I knew the sun would disappear soon. So I turned back, feeling the tension in my chest grow. Back at the cabin, I tried to shake off the feeling. I started a fire in the wood stove and made myself some soup from a can. The flames crackled, casting flickering shadows on the walls, and for a while, the warmth made me feel safe. I sat in the rocking chair, staring into the fire, listening to the occasional pop and hiss of the logs. Outside, the wind had picked up, making the branches scrape against the cabin walls. The sound was sharp, and sometimes it felt almost like scratching, like someone or something was circling the cabin just out of sight. I told myself it was nothing, just the wind, and tried to focus on the fire. The night was long. I woke multiple times to strange sounds. A branch snapping outside, the rustle of leaves, the faint thump of something heavy moving around the clearing. My mind imagined shapes in the darkness outside the window, but each time I forced myself to look, nothing was there. By 3 a.m., I stopped trying to sleep. I sat on the edge of the bed, listening to the night, hearing the creak of the cabin settling, the occasional distant cry of an animal, and the wind whipping against the trees. I realized how completely isolated I was. If something happened to me here, there was no one to help. That thought made my stomach churn. The next day, I decided to explore the area more systematically. I packed a backpack with water, snacks, a first aid kit, and a small hatchet I found in the cabin. I traced the faint trail I had seen the day before, deeper into the forest. The ground was damp, uneven, and covered with fallen leaves. Every few steps, I would hear a sound that made me freeze. The snapping of a branch behind me, the distant crackle of underbrush, the faint thump of something moving. I kept looking around, but the forest was dense. I realized I had no way of knowing how far I had gone or how to get back if I kept going. Still, I pressed on. There was something compelling about this place, something that made my stomach tighten but my feet keep moving. After walking for over an hour, I stumbled across an old, abandoned hunting camp. There was a rusted fire pit, a few broken chairs, and a lean-to made of tarps and old wood. I felt a surge of relief. Someone had been here before me, but the place was obviously long abandoned. The tarps were torn, and the wood was rotting. Then I noticed something else. A series of footprints leading away from the camp, deeper into the forest. They were fresh, and they didn't belong to any animal I knew. Human footprints. My heart pounded. I debated following them, but decided against it. Whoever or whatever made them could be dangerous. I headed back to the cabin, my eyes constantly scanning the dense woods for movement. Back at the cabin, I tried to relax. I locked all the doors and windows, even though I knew it wouldn't stop someone determined. I checked the hatchet, making sure it was sharp and within reach. I ate a small dinner, and as night fell, the noises outside returned. This time, they were closer. I could hear steps circling the cabin, the occasional scrape against the wall, and what sounded like breathing just beyond the tree line. I stayed as quiet as possible, trying not to make a sound. The wind was loud, and I hoped it masked my presence. Hours passed. I sat in the dark, clutching the hatchet. Every noise outside made me flinch. I realized that whoever or whatever was out there, they had been watching me for hours. I thought about trying to leave, but the forest at night was a maze. Couldn't risk it. I had to wait until dawn. When the first light came, I cautiously stepped outside. The clearing was empty. There were footprints in the mud, human footprints, circling the cabin, but no one was there. Whoever had been watching had left, at least for now. I spent the entire day reinforcing the cabin. I piled extra wood against the doors, wedged sticks under the windows, and even dug a shallow trench around the porch in case someone tried to approach. My nerves were raw, but I knew I had to make the cabin as secure as possible. For the next 2 days, I stayed inside almost entirely. I ventured out only to gather water from a nearby stream, always moving quickly and scanning the forest for signs of movement. The footprints were still there, circling the cabin at night, but no one ever approached while I was awake. I started to notice patterns. The sounds came mostly after midnight, sometimes lasting for hours, and they never followed a straight path. Whoever it was, they were deliberately trying to intimidate me. By the third night, exhaustion was overwhelming. I couldn't sleep, couldn't eat much, couldn't stop thinking about the forest around me. I realized I had to take control of the situation. I decided to prepare a signal. I gathered a pile of wood and dry leaves outside, in the clearing where it could be seen from the road if anyone passed. I set it on fire with a flare I had brought for emergencies, creating a column of smoke visible for miles. My hope was that someone traveling through the forest would see it and come to help. I stayed nearby, ready to defend myself if needed. Hours passed. The fire burned high, the smoke curling into the sky. I thought I heard voices in the distance. Then I saw headlights cutting through the trees. A vehicle appeared on the dirt road leading toward the cabin. Relief washed over me like a wave. The truck stopped a few dozen yards away, and a man stepped out. He was a local ranger responding to the smoke signal. I ran toward him, tears streaming down my face, clutching the hatchet but no longer caring. He called for backup, and soon another ranger arrived. They inspected the cabin, the footprints, the signs of someone watching me. They said it was a gang of local squatters, known for intimidating anyone who stayed in the abandoned cabins. I stayed at the cabin under the watch of the rangers until the situation was completely resolved. The squatters had been caught, and the area was secured. Finally, after I had been planning the trip for months, though in truth it was more of a retreat than a vacation. I needed to get away from the noise, the endless chatter of work emails, and the constant hum of the city. The cabin I rented was far from any road, tucked deep in a forest that stretched for miles. From the description and the photos, it seemed perfect. A simple wooden structure with a small porch, a fireplace, and a creek that ran nearby. The images online made it look idyllic, but I never imagined how isolating it would feel once I was actually there. The drive was long and winding. The paved road eventually gave way to dirt, and the trees closed in around me, forming a tunnel of green that muted the sun. Every so often, a shadow would flicker across the windshield. A deer, perhaps, or a stray branch swaying in the wind. By the time I pulled up to the cabin, the sky was a pale orange, the sun dipping behind the dense forest canopy. The air was heavy with the smell of pine and wet soil, rich and earthy. My heart had a strange mix of excitement and nervousness. I had come here for solitude, but being alone in the middle of nowhere carried a weight I hadn't fully considered. The cabin was exactly as it looked in the photos. The wood smelled faintly of old smoke and damp. The floorboards creaked underfoot, and the windows were smudged with dust. I set my bags down and walked to the porch, watching the creek shimmer in the late afternoon light. Birds chirped intermittently, and somewhere in the distance, a woodpecker tapped against a tree. Everything was still, peaceful, almost too perfect. I unpacked, setting my essentials on a small table near the fireplace, and began preparing dinner. There was a small woodpile stacked neatly by the side of the cabin, and I fed a few logs into the fireplace. The smell of burning wood filled the cabin, warm and comforting against the chill that had begun creeping through the walls. By the time night fell, the forest was transformed. The shadows seemed to stretch further than they should, and the sounds of nocturnal creatures filled the air. The creek now whispered rather than babbled, a constant undertone that reminded me of how isolated I was. I had brought lanterns, and I lit one to wander around the small area immediately surrounding the cabin. The beam of light cut through the darkness, illuminating the rough texture of tree bark, the glint of dew on leaves, and the occasional reflection of an insect's eye. Everything was quiet, but the quiet was deep and heavy, pressing in on me from all sides. I went back inside, shut the door, and checked the locks. They were simple, nothing elaborate, just a latch and a bolt. Enough for a cabin like this, I told myself. I spent the evening preparing for the night, stacking more wood, filling a jug with water from the creek, and checking my supplies. The cabin was old but serviceable. The windows rattled slightly in the wind, and I could hear the creek flowing, a soft, constant background noise that was almost hypnotic. I set my alarm for early the next day, planning to hike a trail that the host had marked on a map. I wanted to see the forest, maybe take some photographs, and just breathe the quiet air. Eventually, I crawled into the small bed, the blanket scratchy but warm, and fell asleep to the sound of the creek. I woke to the first rays of sunlight filtering through the trees. The forest was alive with sound. Birds, insects, and the occasional rustle of something moving in the undergrowth. I dressed quickly, made a small breakfast, and packed a bag for the hike. The trail began just a few hundred meters from the cabin, a narrow path winding through dense underbrush. At first, it was easy to follow, marked with small wooden signs nailed to trees, but the deeper I went, the less maintained it became. Fallen branches littered the path, and roots snaked across it like obstacles in a natural obstacle course. The air was damp, heavy with the smell of wet leaves, and the ground was soft underfoot. I kept moving, telling myself I would reach a clearing where the map indicated a viewpoint. It was around midday when I noticed the first signs that something wasn't quite right. I had been careful to mark my path in subtle ways, breaking small twigs and noting distinctive trees so I could retrace my steps. When I stopped to check the map, I realized I had walked past the last marker. The trail should have turned sharply to the right, but the path continued straight, and the forest ahead looked unfamiliar. Panic rose slightly in my chest. I stopped, listening, but all I could hear was the wind through the trees and the distant murmur of the creek. I took a deep breath, convinced myself I could find the trail again, and pressed forward. The forest seemed to grow darker as I moved deeper in. The canopy thickened, letting in only narrow slivers of sunlight. Shadows pooled in every corner, and the sound of the creek faded. My pace slowed as I stumbled over roots and rocks, each misstep sending a shock of cold through my legs. I tried to keep calm, remembering the small first aid kit in my backpack and the fact that I had water and snacks. The forest was quiet in a way that made my own breathing sound loud, almost intrusive. Hours seemed to pass, though I had no real sense of time. As the afternoon dragged on, I began to notice the animals had stopped. The birds that had filled the early morning were gone. No rustling in the underbrush, no squirrels darting between trees, just silence. I stopped again, scanning the area, trying to reassure myself. Maybe they had moved deeper into the forest, away from humans. My stomach tightened. Being alone is one thing when you can hear life around you. Being alone in a forest that feels abandoned is entirely different. By late afternoon, the sun was low, filtering through the branches in long beams. My stomach growled, and my water supply was running low. I knew I had to find the cabin soon. I tried to retrace my steps, but the forest had become a maze. Trees that had seemed distinct earlier now blurred together. Every tree looked like the one before, every bend in the path looked the same. Anxiety gnawed at me. I began calling out, hoping my voice would carry to the creek or perhaps scare away whatever predator might be hiding. But the sound seemed to vanish instantly. The silence returned, heavier than before. As evening approached, the temperature dropped sharply. I hadn't brought more than a light jacket, and the wind began to pick up, whistling through the trees. Shadows stretched long and strange across the ground, and the forest floor, once soft, became uneven and treacherous. Every step had to be careful. I tripped multiple times, scraping my knees and hands on jagged rocks and thorny underbrush. Fear had settled into a cold, physical knot in my stomach. Night came faster than I expected. By the time I realized it, the forest was almost pitch black. I had no flashlight, only the dim glow of a small headlamp, which made everything look distorted. My heart was hammering. The creek sound had disappeared entirely. I stumbled forward blindly, hoping to find some sign of the cabin, but each step seemed to take me deeper into an endless sea of trees. Panic set in fully now. My breathing was ragged, my hands and legs numb from cold and exhaustion. I began to imagine the worst. Getting lost forever, injured, no one knowing where I was. Every sound, every snap of a branch, every rustle in the leaves, made me jump. I eventually found a small clearing, but there was nothing in it. Just tall grass, a few rocks, and the bare outline of trees against the night sky. I decided I needed to stay put, conserve energy, and wait for daylight. I huddled against a tree, wrapping my arms around myself. The cold was biting, and I shivered uncontrollably. The forest at night is alive in ways that are almost invisible. Tiny rustlings, the movement of insects, the occasional distant call of an owl. Every small noise set my nerves on edge. I tried to rest, but sleep was impossible. The fear too strong, the loneliness too deep. Morning came sluggishly. Dawn was a faint gray light, leaking through the dense canopy. I forced myself to stand, legs stiff and aching. The first priority was water. I found the creek after a cautious search, its murmur weak and thin in the early morning. I drank carefully, cupped my hands to avoid contaminating the water too much. The small act of survival brought some relief. I took a moment to gather myself, thinking through the route I had taken the previous day. I remembered a bend in the trail near a fallen log that had a distinctive shape, and I tried to orient myself from there. Hours passed as I carefully moved, my body sore and tired. The forest, though less threatening in the daylight, still felt vast and endless. Every step required attention. I stumbled over roots, slipped on wet patches of moss, and my backpack dragged heavily against my shoulders. I had to ration what remained of my water and snacks. By midday, I began to recognize landmarks. The creek's bend, a cluster of trees with white bark, a moss-covered rock shaped like a half moon. Slowly, painstakingly, I retraced. I had been planning this cabin trip for months, a private escape from the chaos of my life. My job had become unbearable, the city noisy, and I felt the constant pressure of deadlines and obligations pressing down on me. I wanted silence, solitude, and the kind of emptiness that made it possible to hear your own thoughts without the world intruding. I had found a small cabin listed online, tucked deep in the northern mountains, far from roads and towns, reached only by a gravel path that wound through dense forest. The photos promised a rustic, yet comfortable retreat. Wood walls, a small stone fireplace, a lofted sleeping area, and a porch that looked out over a quiet clearing. It seemed perfect. The listing emphasized privacy, which I wanted above all else. The drive up was long, more exhausting than I expected. I left the city early in the morning, taking back roads to avoid highways and traffic, and watched the scenery shift from suburban sprawl to endless green. Forests pressed in on either side of the road, the trees tall and dark, their trunks slick from recent rain. Occasionally, I glimpsed deer or small animals darting across the roadside. By the time I reached the gravel path that would take me to the cabin, the sun was low in the sky, casting long shadows between the trees. The road was narrow, uneven, and occasionally washed out, forcing me to drive slowly and carefully. I kept telling myself it would be worth it. When I finally arrived, I parked my car at the edge of the clearing. The cabin stood a short walk away, its wooden exterior dark against the deepening sky. The first thing I noticed was how silent it was. There was no sound of traffic, no hum of electricity, no voices, no birds, just the occasional rustle of leaves and the far-off cry of a coyote. I grabbed my bags and walked the last few meters to the porch, feeling an uneasy thrill at the total isolation. The cabin smelled faintly of wood polish and smoke, and the fireplace was already set up with a small stack of logs. I dropped my bags and ran my hands along the smooth, cold wood of the walls. After unpacking, I made a small fire in the fireplace, enjoying the way the flames crackled and the room filled with warmth. Outside, night was falling quickly. The forest beyond the clearing became a mass of black shapes, and the air was thick with the smell of wet earth and pine. I had brought food, water, a first aid kit, and all the supplies I thought I would need. I was confident, almost smug in my preparation. But as darkness settled, a quiet unease began to creep in. I told myself it was normal. The first night in a new, isolated place always felt strange, but I could not shake the feeling that I was being watched. The first night passed uneventfully. I slept on the lofted bed, the wooden frame creaking slightly under my weight. Outside, I occasionally heard the snap of branches or the movement of animals. In the morning, the sun rose through a dense fog, covering the clearing in white light that seemed almost unreal. I stepped outside and walked around the cabin, checking the perimeter and the surrounding woods. Everything seemed peaceful, almost idyllic. I spent the day chopping firewood, exploring the nearby creek, and noting the trails that led deeper into the forest. It was the second night when things began to feel wrong. I had been inside the cabin, preparing dinner, when I heard it, a sound that made my stomach twist. Footsteps, slow, deliberate, outside the cabin. I froze, listening. The steps did not come from the gravel path where I had parked. They came from the dense trees beyond the clearing. They were soft but heavy enough to suggest someone or something was moving through the underbrush, staying just out of view. I told myself it was impossible. I was alone. There was no road for a vehicle, no houses for neighbors, and I had not seen another person for hours. I sat by the fireplace, firelight casting long shadows on the walls, and waited. The footsteps came again, then stopped. I strained my ears, hearing nothing but the wind through the trees. Minutes passed. Then the sound of something dragging on the ground. It was faint at first, like the scrape of a branch or a log, but unmistakably deliberate. My heart began to race. I grabbed my flashlight and stepped onto the porch, sweeping the beam across the clearing. There was nothing, only darkness and trees. I tried to calm myself. Animals could make noises like this. Deer could drag fallen branches. But the sound had been too rhythmic, too purposeful. Over the next few hours, the sounds continued intermittently. Scraping, stepping, a low thud that shook the porch boards. Each time, I would rush to the window or step outside with my flashlight, and nothing was there. The cabin, which had felt comforting and secure in the daylight, now felt like a trap. The isolation, the lack of human presence, suddenly became frightening. I double-checked my doors and windows, making sure everything was locked. I stacked more firewood near the entrance in case I needed to barricade myself. Sleep was impossible. The next morning, I found something unsettling. In the soft mud near the edge of the clearing were footprints. They were not large, but they were distinct, human, and recent. I traced them with my finger in disbelief. They came from the forest, circled near the cabin, and then disappeared back into the trees. No one could have walked through the dense underbrush so quietly and carefully unless they knew the area. Panic began to build, but I forced myself to think rationally. Perhaps a hiker had passed through. But why had I not seen them? And why had the footsteps returned every night? I spent the day preparing. I gathered extra wood, filled containers with water, and set up a small stash of food in case I had to barricade myself. I checked my phone, no signal. Satellite maps showed I was several miles from the nearest road. The nearest neighbors were at least 10 miles away. I realized that if someone intended to harm me, there was little I could do. I had tools, a heavy kitchen knife, a small axe for chopping wood, but no real means of defense. That night, the sounds returned with a vengeance. Footsteps dragging, low thuds against the walls of the cabin. Whoever it was, they had moved closer. I could hear them circling the cabin, crouching, moving in the shadows of the trees. My chest ached with tension. My hands trembled as I held the flashlight like a weapon. I sat in the corner, near the fireplace, listening and waiting. Hours passed. At one point, the sound stopped completely, leaving only silence that felt heavier than any noise. I stayed alert, my mind racing, imagining every possible scenario. Morning came. I forced myself outside to inspect the perimeter. More footprints, closer than before, but no other sign of a person. My supplies remained untouched, my door still locked. Yet the sense of intrusion lingered. I decided to act, but cautiously. I needed a plan that did not rely on confronting whoever or whatever was out there directly. I began clearing a small path through the trees near the edge of the clearing, creating a trail that could be seen from the cabin. My goal was simple. If anyone approached, I wanted to have an early warning. I also dug small holes near the clearing, hidden under leaves, large enough to trip someone moving through the underbrush. It was desperate and primitive, but it gave me a sense of control. For the next 2 days, I maintained vigilance. Every sound was analyzed, every shadow studied. I avoided walking far from the cabin. My food dwindled, my movements were restricted to daylight, and my anxiety grew heavier each night. The forest, which had seemed beautiful and calming at first, now felt hostile, alive in ways I could not control. The clearing, once a place of peaceful sunlight and soft grass, became a trap, a space where I was vulnerable and exposed. On the third night, the intruder made a critical mistake. I had been awake for hours, staring out the window into the black trees, listening to distant noises. Around midnight, I heard the faintest crunching of leaves, then a snap of a branch, followed by a heavy footstep right at the edge of the clearing. I focused my flashlight on the source, and there he was, a man, crouched, trying to move quietly. He froze when the light hit him. I could see him clearly. Mid-30s, wearing dark clothing, his face partly obscured by a hood. He had no weapon visible, but the way he moved suggested he was planning something. I stayed still, calculating my next move. I had no phone signal. If I screamed, I would alert him, but if I did nothing, he could come closer. I remembered the small trail I had cleared and the hidden holes I had dug. Slowly, I reached for my axe and positioned myself near one of the holes. When he stepped forward, my heart hammering in my chest, he tripped over one of the hidden pits. He fell hard, cursing, and I could hear him scrambling to regain balance. That gave me the opportunity to move outside, axe raised, ready to defend myself. The man froze again, and I shouted, loud enough to pierce the night, "Stay back!" My voice I had been planning the trip for months, ever since the thought came to me that I needed to get away from the city for a while. The noise, the people, the constant feeling of being watched and followed. It had all worn me down. I wanted something completely isolated, somewhere I could be alone with my thoughts, with nothing around but the trees, the sky, and the ground beneath my feet. That's how I ended up deciding on this cabin. A small wooden structure tucked deep into a forest I had never been to before. The description online had promised total seclusion. The reviews were short but positive. Clean, rustic, quiet. That was all I wanted. I packed my car with enough food, water, firewood, and basic supplies to last a week. I even brought a small first aid kit, knowing that accidents could happen in the woods, and my phone, though I suspected it would have little to no signal once I got there. The drive itself was uneventful. I took back roads and winding highways, following the directions I had printed out. As I left the last town behind, the landscape began to change. The houses thinned, replaced by fields, then by dense forest. The trees grew taller and closer together, the air colder, and the shadows longer. There was a sense of being swallowed by the forest, as if the world I knew was fading behind me and something else was waiting up ahead. It was quiet, except for the soft hum of the engine and the occasional bird or rustle of wind through the trees. I found it strangely comforting at first, this silence. It was unlike anything I had felt in months. When I finally arrived at the cabin, the sun was low in the sky, brushing the forest with an orange glow. The cabin was small, wooden, and looked well kept from the outside. It had a front porch with a couple of chairs, a stack of firewood neatly piled to one side, and a metal roof that gleamed faintly in the last light of day. I parked the car, unloaded my things, and spent some time just standing there, taking in the stillness. Felt peaceful, almost too peaceful. I unpacked, organized my supplies, and lit a small fire in the fireplace. The cabin smelled faintly of old wood and dust, but it was clean. The furniture was basic but functional. A table with 2 chairs, a small bed, and a few shelves. There was a sink and a small gas stove in the corner. I settled in, eating a simple dinner of canned beans and bread, enjoying the quiet. At first, I felt completely relaxed, as if I had truly escaped the world. But as night began to fall, the forest outside the windows grew darker and more oppressive. The shadows seemed deeper, the sounds more pronounced. I could hear the wind shifting branches, the occasional snap of a twig, the distant rustle of leaves. Every sound was sharp in the silence. Around midnight, I started to feel a creeping sense of unease. I couldn't put my finger on why. The cabin felt safe, sturdy walls, locked doors, firewood ready. But my mind kept drifting to the forest outside. What if someone had followed me? What if there was some person or animal lurking just beyond the trees? I told myself it was paranoia, that I was fine, that the isolation itself was just amplifying my imagination. Still, I decided to lock the doors and windows, check the cabin thoroughly. Everything seemed in order. Nothing had changed, but the feeling didn't leave. I tried to sleep, but every time I closed my eyes, I imagined shapes moving outside, dark figures among the trees, shadows stretching unnaturally close. I eventually drifted off, though sleep felt uneasy and shallow. The next morning, I woke to a cold cabin. I hadn't expected it to be this chilly. The fire had gone out overnight, leaving the room dim and damp. I started another fire and brewed some coffee, trying to shake off the lingering tension from the night. As I moved around the cabin, I noticed something odd. The firewood that had been stacked neatly outside was slightly scattered. Not wildly, just enough to suggest that something or someone had brushed against it. My heart started to race. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe the wind had blown some branches, maybe an animal had come by. Still, I took extra precautions that day. I went into the forest only on marked paths, kept my phone nearby, and made sure all the doors were locked whenever I went inside. The unease grew over the next couple of days. I noticed small things that didn't make sense. The door to the back porch, which I had locked, seemed slightly ajar one morning. Small items I had left on the table were shifted slightly when I returned from a short walk. I kept telling myself I was imagining it, that the isolation was affecting my mind, but I couldn't shake the feeling that someone else was here. I began carrying a knife with me whenever I went outside, though I never wanted to use it. I thought about calling for help, but the phone had no signal. The nearest town was miles away, and I had chosen this place precisely because it was remote. Now that remoteness felt like a trap. On the third night, the feeling escalated. The forest outside the cabin was alive with strange sounds. Low, guttural, and intermittent. I couldn't identify them. Not animal sounds I knew. The wind didn't carry them from far away. They were close, too close. I stayed inside, sitting near the fire with the knife on my lap, my ears straining to catch any noise. Around 2 a.m, I heard it. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate, moving around the perimeter of the cabin. My heart pounded so loudly I was sure whoever or whatever was out there could hear it. The steps stopped occasionally, then started again, circling the cabin. I held my breath, listening, praying they wouldn't notice me inside. I wanted to confront the reality, but fear kept me rooted in place. Hours passed. Eventually, the footsteps stopped. The rest of the night was filled with the sounds of wind and distant wildlife, but I could not sleep. I spent the early hours of morning sharpening the knife, checking all the doors and windows again, making sure everything was as secure as possible. My nerves were frayed. I felt trapped in a place that had promised peace, but instead it had become a cage of tension and fear. The next day, I decided I needed to do something. I couldn't stay like this, constantly on edge, wondering if someone was outside, watching. I packed essentials in a backpack: some food, water, first aid kit, and the knife. I had to leave, at least to check the surrounding area, find a place where I could get help if needed. I moved cautiously, checking the trees and underbrush as I went, noting any movement. The forest felt denser than before, oppressive in a way that made the air feel thick. I walked for hours, careful to stay on visible trails. Occasionally, I thought I saw movement out of the corner of my eye, a shadow, a branch moving unnaturally. But every time I turned, there was nothing. I tried to rationalize it. Animals, wind, my mind playing tricks on me. But the tension in my chest refused to ease. By the late afternoon, I had circled around the cabin's area and returned. Nothing had attacked me. Nothing had confronted me directly. Still, I could not shake the sense that the forest held a presence I could not define. I realized I had been lucky. That realization gave me a strange mix of fear and determination. I decided to stay one more night, hoping that daylight would bring clarity, that the forest's silence in the day would make me feel safe again. That night was less tense, but I remained vigilant. I kept the fire burning, the knife at my side, and stayed alert. I noticed details I hadn't before. The way shadows shifted with the firelight, the smell of damp wood mixed with pine, the distant call of birds as night creatures stirred. I began to understand that isolation magnifies everything. Every sound, every movement becomes a threat when you have no context, when there is nothing familiar around you. My mind had been constructing threats out of the unknown, and yet that didn't remove the real danger of being alone in the forest. Predators, careless accidents, exposure, they were real, That understanding made me cautious, but also strangely empowered. I could survive here, but only if I respected the environment and stayed alert. The next morning, I woke early and made a plan. I would leave the cabin, follow the trail back to the main road, and head toward civilization. I packed everything efficiently, leaving the cabin exactly as I found it. I didn't want to attract anyone's attention or leave evidence that someone had been here. As I walked, I kept my senses sharp, noting every sound and movement. Occasionally, I glimpsed signs of wildlife. Deer tracks, bird nests, small animals scurrying through the underbrush. It was normal life continuing, indifferent to my fear and tension. That realization was comforting in a strange way. Life goes on even in the quietest, most isolated places. By late afternoon, I emerged from the forest onto the main road. A car passed by, and I waved frantically until it slowed and stopped. The driver, surprised, listened as I explained my situation. They offered a ride. I had always liked the quiet. Cities with their endless noise, the blaring horns, shouting, sirens, and the constant buzz of people moving somewhere faster than the last moment always gave me a sense of unease I couldn't shake. For years, I had been planning a getaway to a place where no one would bother me, where I could be alone with only the wind, the trees, and the occasional bird for company. That's how I ended up choosing a cabin tucked deep in a remote forest several hours' drive from the nearest town. The cabin wasn't advertised as anything special, just a small wooden structure owned by a man who barely responded to my messages and left the keys in a lockbox on arrival. It was perfect in its anonymity, perfect in its isolation, and perfect for someone like me who wanted nothing but a few days of absolute solitude. The drive to the cabin was long, far longer than I had expected. I had taken the main roads initially, but as I got deeper into the countryside, I had to follow narrow, winding paths through dense forest, roads so overgrown that my car scraped branches and the underbrush pressed against the tires. It made me nervous at first, the thought that if my car broke down, I would be trapped with no signal and no one for miles. But at the same time, it felt exhilarating. There was a strange comfort in knowing that I couldn't be reached, that I had no obligations for a little while, and I relished it. When I finally reached the cabin, the sun was low, casting long, trembling shadows between the trees. The cabin was older than I had imagined, made of rough timber, with a slanted roof and a stone chimney. The windows were dark and clean, reflecting the forest around it. There was a small porch with a single chair rocking slightly in the breeze, though there had been no wind for hours. The lockbox was exactly where the owner had said, and inside were the keys. I took a deep breath and unlocked the cabin, pushing the door open. Inside, the smell of old wood and something faintly musty hit me. The air was cool, colder than outside, and the floorboards creaked under my weight. There was a single room with a small kitchenette in the corner and a wood-burning stove opposite a narrow bed. A small bathroom was tucked behind a door, and a loft above could be reached by a ladder. I set my bags down, running my fingers over the wooden surfaces. Everything was clean but worn, as if it had been lived in but rarely touched. I unpacked the essentials, laid out my sleeping bag, and lit the stove, feeling the warmth slowly creep into the room. Outside, the forest was quiet, almost unnaturally so. No birds sang, no squirrels scurried, and even the wind seemed hesitant. I dismissed it, telling myself that it was simply the end of the day, that animals were settling down, that silence was normal this far from civilization. The first night passed without incident. I slept with the windows slightly open to hear the night air, the wind rustling the leaves, the distant sound of some animal, maybe a deer, moving through the forest. It was peaceful. The second day, I explored the surrounding area, hiking along paths that had grown over and were barely distinguishable. The trees were dense, their thick canopies blocking most of the sunlight. Occasionally, I would find remnants of old campsites, burned-out fire pits, broken bottles, bits of torn fabric caught on branches, but nothing recent. Nothing that suggested anyone had been there in the last few months. I felt calm, satisfied in my isolation, and the unease that had been with me during the drive faded. I told myself that this was why I had come. To escape, to be alone, to feel the quiet without fear. But as night fell, the forest changed. On the third evening, I noticed the sounds of the night were not entirely natural. At first, it was small. A snap of a branch far off, maybe a deer, I thought. Then a rustling in the underbrush closer to the cabin. At first, I told myself it was nothing. Animals were curious, they moved at night. But the sounds continued, deliberate, close, and then I heard a heavy footstep on the dry leaves, followed by another, slower, heavier. My pulse quickened. I tried to tell myself that it was impossible for anyone to have found the cabin, that I was miles from the nearest road. But the footsteps moved around the cabin perimeter, circling slowly. I stayed perfectly still inside, convinced I was imagining it. The next day, I found my fears confirmed in a subtle way. Small things had changed. A branch that had been leaning against the cabin the day before was now lying across the porch. A rock that had rested near the steps was now inside the doorframe. Nothing major, nothing that screamed danger, but enough to make me realize that someone, or something, had been around while I slept. I checked the perimeter, walking carefully around the cabin. There were faint footprints pressed into the soft dirt and leaves, large and heavy, heading from the woods to the cabin and back again. No tire tracks, no signs of a vehicle. Whoever it was had come on foot. My stomach tightened. I tried to tell myself to leave, to drive back to civilization, but the road was narrow, the day was already halfway gone, and there was a small part of me that wanted to see this through. Maybe the rational part of me thought I could handle it. I barricaded the doors, stacking furniture against them where I could, and stayed inside the cabin for the night. I kept a knife from my bag within reach, and another hand axe beside the bed. The stove's warmth, the only thing keeping the cabin from feeling entirely suffocating. Every shadow pressed against the walls, every creak of the wood seemed amplified. Around midnight, I heard the steps again. Heavy, slow, deliberate. They circled the cabin, stopping at each side, pausing as if someone were listening. My heart thumped so violently I thought it might burst from my chest. I crouched by the stove, staring at the window, willing myself to stay calm, willing myself to remember that if this person wanted me harm, they could easily have done it by now. The footsteps continued for what felt like hours, then faded. The sun eventually rose, casting a pale light through the trees, and the forest returned to its quiet normalcy. By the fourth day, I decided I had to act. Staying in the cabin alone, knowing someone had been watching, was too dangerous. I packed my things with deliberate care, trying to move quietly so that I could leave without alerting anyone. I did not want a confrontation. I wanted escape. I mapped out the path back to the main road, marking turns with small piles of stones in case I got disoriented. As I stepped outside, I realized that I had been observed once more. Footprints led from the woods to the edge of the porch. I could feel it in my chest, the unmistakable awareness of someone standing just beyond my sight, watching me leave. I began my trek through the overgrown paths. Every snap of a twig, every rustle of leaves, made me flinch. I moved quickly but carefully, aware that the forest could conceal a person easily. Hours passed, and I found my pace slowing as fatigue set in. My mind ran through possibilities, scenarios where I might be trapped, ambushed, forced back to the cabin. Panic pressed against me with each step, but I forced myself forward, one foot after the other. Finally, after what felt like endless time, I emerged onto the main road. A car passed slowly by, the driver giving me a curious glance. Relief flooded me, and I realized I had never felt so alive and grateful in my life. I stopped at a gas station a few miles down the road. I told the attendant where I had been, the isolation, the footsteps, the cabin. He listened, nodding but not questioning, and advised me never to go back to that forest alone. I agreed silently, paying for gas and snacks, and called a friend to pick me up. When they arrived, I didn't hesitate. I got into the car and left, glancing back only once to see the dense forest stretching endlessly, quiet, indifferent, but no longer inviting. That experience stayed with me. I never returned to cabins in the woods. I realized that isolation is not always peaceful, that the quiet can be filled with unseen dangers, and that humans can be as frightening as any natural predator when you are alone. The cabin itself remained empty after I left, as I later found out from the owner, who had no idea anyone else had been near the property. The footprints disappeared, and there were no signs of anyone inhabiting the place. I told myself it was probably a transient person, someone who moved through the woods, harmless perhaps, but the fear I felt was real. Every time I think back, I remember the heavy, deliberate footsteps circling the cabin, the shadows that seemed to press closer at night, and the suffocating realization that sometimes being alone in the forest means you are not truly alone at all. I eventually came to understand that the danger was never supernatural, never imagined, but painfully real and human. And while I escaped unscathed, I carry that awareness with me. The world is full of hidden threats, even in places that seem untouched and quiet. The forest had taught me something essential: vigilance, preparation, and respect for isolation. That cabin, once a dream of peace, became a symbol of caution, a lesson in the raw vulnerability that's I had been planning the trip for months, ever since I found the listing for the small cabin deep in the mountains. It was tucked away far enough that it promised privacy, silence, and a break from the constant noise of the city. The pictures were simple: a single-story wooden structure with a slanted roof, a small porch, and windows that reflected the dense surrounding forest. The road leading to it was little more than a dirt track, barely wide enough for a single car, lined by thick trees that seemed to lean toward each other over the path, forming a kind of tunnel. I thought it would be perfect, a place to disconnect and spend a few days alone with only my thoughts. I drove the 6 hours from the city in a rental SUV, loaded with supplies: bottled water, canned food, a couple of sleeping bags, my laptop for writing, a lantern, a full first aid kit, and a small gas stove. I had planned for everything, down to a few extra blankets in case it got cold. The last hour of the drive, the dirt track deteriorated further. Potholes appeared, puddles from recent rains made sections slippery, and branches scraped against the sides of the car. I slowed down, gripping the steering wheel tightly, paying attention to every shadow the trees cast across the road. Occasionally, I thought I saw something move in the corner of my eye. A deer, I told myself, but I couldn't be sure. When I finally reached the cabin, the sun was low, painting the sky in shades of orange and deep purple. The cabin sat on a slight incline, surrounded by tall pines and oaks. A small creek ran a few meters to one side, the water moving quickly over rocks, producing a constant, soothing murmur. At first glance, the cabin looked abandoned. The wood was dark and weathered, the windows streaked, and the door looked like it hadn't been painted in years. But it was intact, solid, and welcoming in a rustic way. I parked the car near the porch, opened the trunk, and started unloading. The first thing I noticed when I stepped inside was the smell. A mix of damp wood, old pine, and something faintly metallic. It wasn't unpleasant, just sharp. The interior was basic: a small living area with a wood stove, a kitchen with minimal appliances, a narrow hallway leading to 2 bedrooms, and a small bathroom. The floorboards creaked under my weight, and I felt every movement echo in the otherwise silent space. The first night was quiet, almost unnervingly so. The only sounds were the wind in the trees, the creek outside, and an occasional distant bird call. I lit the lantern and made a simple meal, sitting at the small wooden table. Outside, the forest darkened to a near black, and the shadows of the trees swayed in the dim light. I went to bed early, planning to get an early start on exploring the surrounding trails the next morning. The bed was firm and narrow, the sheets a little rough, but clean. I woke in the middle of the night to a sound that made my stomach tighten. It was faint, like a soft scraping or dragging, coming from outside. My first thought was an animal, a raccoon, perhaps, or something larger moving through the underbrush. I stayed very still, straining to hear. The sound stopped after a few minutes, but my pulse had quickened. I lay there in the dark, trying to convince myself it was nothing, but sleep did not come easily. The following morning, I woke early and decided to walk down to the creek. The air was crisp, the forest filled with the smell of wet earth and pine needles. The dirt was soft under my boots, and each step left a clear imprint. Birds moved through the trees above, their calls echoing off the trunks. I followed the creek for a while, watching the water rush over rocks and fallen branches. There was a strange peace in the isolation, but also a tension I couldn't shake, a feeling of being watched. I kept telling myself it was just my imagination. I returned to the cabin around midday and spent a few hours organizing my supplies, reading, and walking around the property. It was then that I noticed something unusual, a series of footprints leading from the edge of the forest to the cabin porch. They were large, irregular, and I couldn't identify the type of shoe. I froze, staring at them, my stomach knotting. They didn't look recent. The dirt had partially filled in the prints, but they were close enough to the porch that someone had been near my door. My first instinct was to tell myself it was probably a previous visitor, maybe the owner or someone checking the property, but my rational mind didn't make me feel any better. I decided to stay outside for a while, keeping watch, trying to see if anyone was still around. The forest remained silent, but the tension was palpable. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig made me flinch. I returned inside and locked the doors and windows, even though there were no obvious locks besides simple latches. I began to feel the cabin not as a retreat, but as a trap, a small wooden box in the middle of an immense forest, with no one for miles. Night came again. I cooked dinner, the only sounds being the water from the creek and the occasional gust of wind. I tried to read, but my eyes kept drifting to the windows. At one point, I thought I saw movement, something crossing between the trees, but when I blinked, it was gone. My pulse quickened, and I realized I was gripping the edge of the table, knuckles white. I told myself to stay calm, that it was a deer or some other harmless creature. I checked my phone. No signal, not even a bar. I would have no way of calling for help if something happened. I decided to sleep with the lantern lit, thinking the small amount of light might keep whatever was out there away. Around 2 in the morning, I woke again, heart hammering. The same sound from the previous night, dragging or scraping, soft but deliberate, right outside. I froze, listening, hearing it move slowly around the cabin. I considered going to look, but my rational mind screamed that approaching it would be dangerous. I grabbed the only weapon I had, a heavy cast iron skillet from the kitchen. My hands shook as I held it, every muscle tensed. The sound stopped as suddenly as it had started, leaving an eerie silence that pressed in on me from all sides. Morning light came slowly. I hadn't slept more than a few fitful hours. I resolved to leave that day no matter what. But when I went outside, I saw something that made my stomach drop. Footprints, larger and deeper than the ones before, circled the cabin. They hadn't been there yesterday, or at least I hadn't seen them so close and so fresh. Some of the prints were muddy, others pressed into the soft dirt, and they all seemed to suggest movement around the cabin in the middle of the night. There were no other signs. No dropped items, no marks on the door, no evidence of forced entry, but the prints were enough. I felt the full weight of isolation pressing down on me, a stark reminder that the forest was not empty. I decided to pack quickly and leave. Every sound in the forest seemed louder now. The creek, the wind, the rustle of leaves. I kept glancing over my shoulder as I loaded the SUV. As I started the engine, I felt a sharp chill and thought I saw a shadow move among the trees, a figure stepping back and disappearing. I accelerated down the dirt track, not slowing for potholes or puddles, my hands tight on the wheel. I did not look back. The drive back was tense, every snap of a branch, every flutter of a bird making me flinch. It took me far longer than the drive there, my mind racing with the thought of those footprints and the feeling of being watched. By the time I reached the paved road and civilization, I was exhausted, shaking, but relieved. When I returned home, I called the rental company and canceled the trip completely. I didn't even think about going back. The memory of that cabin stayed with me for weeks. The silence that wasn't really silent, the footprints, the feeling that someone or something had been near me and was patient enough to wait until I noticed. I told myself I had been lucky, that nothing had happened, but I also knew that I had been exposed to a danger that couldn't be ignored. I never returned to the forest or stayed in a remote cabin again. The experience taught me the kind of vulnerability you feel when you are truly isolated, surrounded by nature and nothing else. It's a strange, almost primal fear, not the kind from stories or movies, but the fear that exists when you realize that for miles, there is no one to help you, no one to call, and no one to see if something goes wrong. That fear, I realized, stays with you long after you leave the place behind. Even now, months later, I avoid roads that lead deep into the mountains, avoid cabins advertised as secluded, and even on a hike through a local forest, I find my attention drawn constantly to shadows, to footprints, to any sound that breaks the normal rhythm of nature. It was not a ghost, not a story, not a legend. It was simply the reality of isolation and the quiet presence of someone or something that doesn't belong, that can observe, that waits. And knowing that it could happen again anywhere keeps me cautious, alert, and always aware that being alone is not always safe, no matter how serene the place looks at first glance. I had planned the trip for months. The cabin was deep in the mountains, a place I had found online through a small, almost forgotten rental listing. It promised isolation, quiet, and a break from everything that had been pressing on me for the past year. I was tired in ways I could not describe. Tired of people, tired of work, tired of constant noise. The idea of a week alone in the wilderness, with nothing but trees and a small creek, felt like medicine. I packed carefully, making sure I had enough food, a first aid kit, warm clothes, and a flashlight with extra batteries. The rest I thought I could manage. It was just me, a cabin, and the forest. I thought I was ready. The drive to the cabin was longer than I expected. Narrow, winding roads stretched through the mountains with sheer drops on either side. The forest was dense, and sunlight barely touched the road at times. My car struggled with some of the steeper parts, but I kept going, determined. As the hours passed, the traffic disappeared, and the roads were empty. Every turn took me deeper into silence, and the air felt cooler, heavier somehow. I could see the mountains rising in the distance, and at the base of one of them, the cabin was tucked in a small clearing. It looked smaller in person than in the photos, built of old, dark wood, with a stone chimney that had seen decades of smoke. The roof sagged slightly, and the windows were thick with dust and grime. I parked and stepped out. The smell of pine and wet earth hit me instantly. I felt that I had truly left the world behind. The first thing I did was check the cabin. The door opened with a creak. Inside, the smell of wood smoke lingered, faint but unmistakable. Dust covered the floor and the furniture, but nothing seemed broken. The main room had a small kitchen area, a table and a wood stove. There were a few shelves of old, mostly outdated books. A staircase led to a loft that contained a bed, thin mattress and all. It was simple, but it was livable. I unpacked slowly, placing my things carefully, and then I decided to explore the property. The clearing was bigger than I thought. Behind the cabin, the land sloped gently toward a small creek. The water was clear, moving fast over rocks. Birds flitted between trees, and somewhere in the distance, a deer moved through the underbrush. I felt a little thrill at being completely alone in a place like this, free from everything. The first night was surprisingly easy. I built a fire in the wood stove using kindling I found in the shed outside. The warmth was comforting, and I cooked a simple meal of canned beans and rice. The darkness outside was thick. The trees swallowed the light from the cabin windows, and the only sounds were the creak and occasional rustle in the underbrush. I went to bed early, the air cool and fresh, and I slept deeply, more deeply than I had in months. The next morning, I woke to the sound of birds and the soft light filtering through the grimy windows. I made coffee over the stove and sat on the porch, looking at the mountains. Everything felt peaceful, almost unreal. I spent the day walking along the creek, marking the trees with chalk so I could find my way back, and collecting firewood. The forest was alive with sound and movement. Squirrels jumped from branch to branch, and the occasional hawk circled overhead. I felt small, but in a good way, like I was part of something bigger. But as the sun fell that evening, a new feeling started creeping in. It was subtle at first, a prickling at the back of my neck, a sense of being watched. I told myself it was nothing, that it was just the isolation, the unfamiliarity of the forest. Still, I checked the locks on the cabin door twice, even though I knew there was no one for miles. I sat by the fire longer that night, the darkness pressing against the windows. Every shadow in the corner of the room seemed sharper, more distinct. The wind made branches scratch against the walls, and once I thought I heard something heavier, a step maybe, on the porch outside. I froze, straining my ears, but there was only silence. Eventually, I shook it off, telling myself I was letting my mind play tricks on me. Sleep came slowly that night, and it was shallow, filled with half-formed dreams of movement outside. The following days followed a similar rhythm. I woke with the sun, explored the woods, tended the fire, and returned to the cabin before nightfall. But the feeling of being watched didn't go away. On the third day, while gathering firewood, I noticed something unusual. A tree near the creek had markings on it, deep scratches in the bark, not like animal marks, more deliberate, rough, human-like. My heart beat faster as I examined them. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe a hunter, a hiker, someone marking a path. But I hadn't seen any other signs of human presence. No footprints, no litter, nothing. Still, the scratches were recent. The bark was fresh. I looked around nervously and decided to leave. When I returned to the cabin, I checked every window and door. Everything seemed normal, but the unease had settled deeper into my chest. That night, the sound came. Not just the wind or branches, something heavier, slower, deliberate. Footsteps, outside, circling the cabin. I could hear them in the dark, moving softly on the dry leaves. I stayed still, barely breathing, listening. They stopped suddenly, as if someone realized I was aware. Then silence. I sat frozen by the stove for hours, waiting, the fire dying down. I considered leaving immediately, packing up and driving back, but it was too dark and dangerous on the mountain roads. I had to wait until morning. When the sun finally rose, I opened the door cautiously. No footprints, nothing, but the marks on the tree by the creek were still fresh in my mind. I packed some food, water, and essentials into a backpack. I needed to explore more safely, not just sit in the cabin feeling trapped. I spent the day carefully moving along the creek and into the surrounding woods, always alert. I noticed signs I had missed before. Small areas where branches were broken, faint traces of movement through the underbrush. Whoever or whatever had been there was aware of me. Panic started building. I went back to the cabin and spent hours reinforcing the doors and windows with anything I could find. Heavy furniture, sticks jammed into frames. I didn't sleep well that night. Every sound made me jump, and I kept imagining shadows moving across the walls. The fourth day, I decided I couldn't stay inside anymore. I needed to see what was happening. I moved carefully along the tree line, keeping to shadows and avoiding open areas. I followed the creek upstream, noting every unusual mark on trees, disturbed patches of dirt, anything that seemed off. I noticed more marks, deeper scratches, and faint traces of footprints, larger than mine, unlike any animal. It became clear that someone had been in this area, watching, maybe waiting. My anxiety turned into fear. I realized I could not outrun or outwit someone if they wanted to confront me. I had to be smart. That night, the sounds were worse. Not just outside, but near the cabin, brushing against the walls, moving quickly and deliberately. I stayed in the loft, holding a heavy piece of firewood in my hands. Hours passed. I tried to keep calm, but my nerves were shredded. The fire died. I couldn't light it again without drawing attention, and the darkness seemed to close in. When dawn came, I made my decision. I had to leave immediately. I packed everything, leaving nothing behind that could slow me down, and moved toward the car cautiously, checking every shadow, every sound. It felt like hours, but it was only a few minutes. The car was where I left it. I got in and started the engine. The mountain roads were empty, but I drove fast, eyes darting to the trees, expecting someone to appear. None did. I drove until the mountains flattened into hills, until civilization appeared. Only when I saw other cars and signs of life did I let myself relax, though the tension stayed deep in my muscles. Later, I learned from a local that there had been reports of a man living in the woods nearby. He was dangerous, had been seen stalking hikers, and authorities had been searching for him for months. The cabin was close to where he was thought to be. I realized how close I had been to encountering him directly, alone, unarmed, and unaware. The relief I felt was overwhelming. I had survived, but the experience left marks on me, deep ones. I would never look at forests the same way, never underestimate the quiet and isolation. That week, which was supposed to be peaceful, had become one of the most terrifying periods of my life. I was safe now, back in the world, surrounded by people and normal life, but the memory of the cabin, the creek, the marks, and the footsteps would never leave me. The lesson I took with me was clear. Nature is beautiful, but it is also unpredictable. Isolation is a double-edged sword. I survived because I stayed alert, because I noticed the small things, because I trusted my instincts. That cabin I had been planning this trip for months. The idea of escaping the noise and routines of the city, of leaving behind the constant hum of traffic and the endless notifications, had become more than just a desire, it was a need. The cabin I had rented was tucked deep in the mountains, miles away from the nearest town, surrounded by dense forest. The kind of place where the silence pressed in on you and the only sounds were the wind, the rustle of leaves, and sometimes the faint crack of branches snapping under the weight of animals I couldn't see. I thought it would be perfect, a place to disconnect, to read, to write, and just breathe. I did not expect how fast that peace could twist into something else. The drive up was long and tiring. The roads became narrower, winding around steep inclines, with no guardrails in some places, and the trees pressing close on either side. My phone signal disappeared halfway through, just when I passed the last small settlement, a cluster of wooden houses with peeling paint. I remember the moment the map app on my phone stopped working. I laughed to myself, thinking about how dependent I had become on technology, and decided to just trust the directions I had printed out. The cabin was at the end of a rough dirt road, partially overgrown, and I realized I would have to go slowly to avoid damaging my car. I arrived just as the sun began to dip behind the mountains. The cabin was older than I expected from the photos online. Its wood had darkened with age, the paint had faded, and some of the boards were warped. The front porch sagged slightly, but overall it looked sturdy. I parked and got out, stretching, inhaling the cool mountain air. The smell of damp earth, pine, and decay filled my lungs, and I felt a strange mixture of relief and unease. It smelled untouched here, as though no one had passed this way for a long time. I carried my backpack and supplies inside, noting that the cabin was simple but functional. Small kitchen, a wood stove, a few bedrooms, and a living area with old furniture. I placed my things down and started a fire, stacking what I had found neatly cut and stacked in a corner. As darkness fell, the sounds outside changed. The wind picked up, carrying with it the distant calls of birds and the occasional rustle in the underbrush. I was used to city noises, the steady drone of engines, distant sirens, conversations, but here, every sound felt amplified. I had nothing to distract me. No television, no radio, only the shadows of the trees dancing on the walls of the cabin. I tried to focus on writing, but my thoughts kept returning to every noise outside. Every small snap of a branch made me glance toward the window, imagining shapes in the dark that weren't there. That first night, sleep was difficult. The wind rattled the windows, and I kept imagining someone moving outside, just beyond the edge of visibility. I reminded myself that the nearest road was far away, that no one would randomly walk through the forest at this hour. Yet, each sound made my heart beat faster. Eventually, exhaustion won, and I fell into a shallow sleep, one eye half open even in dreams. The next morning, I awoke to silence that was almost unbearable. No wind, no birds, just the stillness of the forest. I made coffee on the stove, letting the smell fill the cabin, trying to calm my nerves. I had planned to explore a trail I had read about, so I packed a small day pack with water, snacks, a flashlight, and a first aid kit. The trail started behind the cabin, disappearing into a dense thicket of pine and spruce. I noticed for the first time that the forest was thick, almost claustrophobic. The trees grew close together, and the underbrush was tangled. The trail itself was little more than a dirt path, scattered with roots and rocks. I started walking, taking careful steps, trying to pay attention to the path rather than the oppressive quiet. The forest felt alive in subtle ways. The creak of branches high above, the flutter of wings, the soft hum of insects. But there was no one else. That fact, which I had thought I would enjoy, began to feel strange. No footsteps, no distant voices, no signs of life other than the forest itself. I rationalized it. People didn't hike this trail often, especially this early in the season. Still, unease crept in, a tension I couldn't shake. Hours passed as I walked deeper into the forest. The trail became less distinct, narrowing until I was stepping over roots and fallen branches, trying to keep a mental map of where I was. I paused at a clearing where the sunlight broke through the canopy, dust motes floating in the beams. I took a deep breath, hoping to shake the growing feeling that I was being watched. I even laughed at myself, shaking my head. Of course, no one was here. I was alone. I had wanted isolation, and now I had it. Then I heard the first sound that froze me. A low, deliberate snapping of a branch, much closer than anything I had encountered. I froze, straining my eyes in the dim light. There was nothing visible, but the sound repeated. Another snap, this one closer. It was the kind of sound that suggests weight, something moving through underbrush, not an animal the size of a deer. I told myself it was probably just a branch falling or a squirrel. I tried to calm down, keeping my eyes on the path, but the sound persisted, subtle now, almost rhythmic, coming from different directions. My pulse quickened. I turned around, scanning the trail behind me. The path looked exactly as it had when I came. Nothing moved, and yet, I felt it, an awareness, a prickling at the back of my neck, that something was watching me. I walked faster, trying to convince myself that the forest was quiet because it was empty. Then I realized that in my rush, I had lost sight of the trail markers. The dirt path became uneven and overgrown, the direction uncertain. Panic began to rise, not a sudden, sharp fear, but a slow, consuming anxiety that made every step heavier. I tried to retrace my steps, but the forest had shifted in subtle ways. Trees looked similar, shadows fell differently, and I realized I could not identify the exact point I had passed through the clearing. I took out my phone to check the map. No signal. My sense of isolation intensified. I walked in one direction for what felt like an hour, constantly checking my surroundings. Every snap of a branch, every rustle of leaves, made me jump, heart hammering. I reminded myself to stay calm, that the forest was indifferent, that people didn't just appear in the woods. But the pressure of being lost was heavy, like water pressing down on my chest. Night began to approach before I found any recognizable landmark. I decided I had to set up a temporary camp, even though I had planned to return to the cabin. I gathered fallen branches and leaves, constructing a small shelter against a large tree. I huddled inside, shivering, trying to make a fire with my small lighter and dry twigs. It was slow, frustrating work, but eventually I managed to get a flame going. I warmed my hands and my coffee flask, trying to convince myself that staying put until morning was the best option. That night, I didn't sleep. Every sound, the distant rustle of leaves, the occasional thump of something falling, kept me alert. I felt exposed, a small human in a vast, indifferent forest. Hunger and fatigue wore at me, but fear kept me awake. I tried to reason, to tell myself that panicking would only make things worse, but the isolation gnawed at me, a constant, low-level terror that I could not escape. I kept imagining someone moving just out of sight, following me silently, patient, unobserved. Morning brought some relief. The forest in daylight was still intimidating, but at least I could see my surroundings. I began moving carefully, marking trees with scratches of my pocket knife, leaving small piles of rocks to track where I had been. The strategy worked in part. I found a faint track I recognized from my morning hike. Step by step, I followed it, keeping a constant watch. Hours passed, and eventually I saw the outline of the cabin, partially obscured by trees. Relief washed over me in waves, a weight lifting from my chest. When I reached the cabin, I collapsed on the porch, exhausted, shaking, but alive. I closed the door behind me, locking it, and lit the stove. I made a simple breakfast, the warmth and smell grounding me. I walked around the cabin, inspecting it carefully, making sure the doors and windows were secure. I realized how vulnerable I had been, how the isolation and disorientation could have been dangerous. I also realized that the fear I had felt, the sense of being hunted or watched, had been amplified by my own mind. Alone, without distractions, the human brain can conjure its own threats. I spent the next day clearing the cabin's surroundings, cutting back overgrown branches, making a small path toward the road. I knew I would not venture into the forest alone again without better preparation. Maps, a GPS device, emergency supplies, and ideally someone with me. I also made a mental note to avoid the more obscure trails that were not well marked. I had been planning this trip for months. The cabin I had rented was far away from the nearest town, tucked deep into the mountains, and I had imagined it as a place to escape from the constant noise of city life. I wanted silence, isolation, and a few days to think, to breathe, and to be entirely alone with my thoughts. The drive there was long and winding, the roads narrow and rough, with pine trees leaning over like guards along the way. I remember the sunlight flickering through the branches, casting long shadows that moved with the car, as if trying to chase me off the road. The deeper I drove into the forest, the more the air changed. It became thicker, cooler, almost sharp with the smell of damp earth and pine needles. The city noises fell away completely, replaced by the occasional sound of birds or the soft rustle of leaves in the wind. I felt relief as the trees swallowed the road behind me, a sense of finally leaving the world I always felt like I was running from. The cabin itself was small but solid. Built from rough-hewn logs, it had a stone chimney that looked like it had been there for decades. I parked my car in a small clearing and walked to the front door, noticing the moss creeping along the edges of the roof, the worn wooden steps, and the way the sunlight hit the glass windows, scattering patterns across the wooden floor inside. The place smelled faintly of damp wood and old fire smoke, but it was clean, lived in enough to feel welcoming, but old enough to feel removed from time. I set my bags down, unlocked the door, and stepped inside, taking a deep breath as the cool air of the cabin wrapped around me. I was alone, absolutely alone, and I liked it. The first day passed in calm routines. I unpacked my things, made a small fire in the stone fireplace, and walked around the immediate area of the cabin, finding a small creek that ran a few hundred meters away. The water was clear and fast, and I dipped my hand in, feeling the cold bite at my skin, and smiled. No one was here to bother me, no traffic, no phones, nothing. Just me and the quiet forest. I collected some fallen branches for firewood and made a small pile beside the cabin. The sunset was slow and orange, and I watched it from the porch, feeling my body relax in ways it hadn't in months. That night, I slept like I hadn't in years, but I woke up several times to strange sounds. At first, I thought it was the wind, or perhaps a branch hitting the roof. The forest can be loud if you're listening, but there was something about the sounds, subtle, almost deliberate, like a footstep on soft dirt. I shook my head and rolled over, telling myself it was the wind. The cabin was solid, the doors locked, and nothing could get inside. I finally fell back asleep, and the next day, I explored further into the forest, staying close to the creek and marking the path with small piles of stones so I could find my way back. The isolation was comforting, even addictive. I began to notice the details I usually missed. The way moss grew in patterns along the trees, the smell of wet earth after stepping in puddles, the sound of a bird landing on a branch far above me. It felt like being awake in a dream. Everything intensified. It wasn't until the second night that things started to feel off. The wind had picked up and the shadows of the trees seemed longer, darker. I had built a fire inside the cabin and was reading on the couch, but I kept glancing toward the windows. That's when I first noticed it. The feeling that someone or something was watching me. Not from inside the cabin, I told myself. Outside, somewhere in the trees. I tried to convince myself it was just my imagination, the natural response to being alone, but the feeling persisted. Every time I looked up, I caught glimpses of movement, something small and fast, slipping between the trees. I kept telling myself it was just a deer, maybe a fox, nothing more. Still, I couldn't shake the tightness in my chest. By the third day, I started noticing things that didn't make sense. A branch lying in a strange position in the yard, footprints in the mud near the creek that weren't mine, slight scuff marks near the back door. I remembered the owner's warning about the local wildlife, but this didn't feel like animals. Someone, I realized with a slow, sinking feeling, had been around the cabin. Not recently enough for me to see them, but recently enough that I wasn't the only one. I told myself to calm down, rationalize. Maybe a hiker passed through, maybe some kids from a nearby town, it didn't mean anything. But the cabin was far enough that random hikers were unlikely. I began double-checking the locks every night, even checking the windows twice. I set some small traps around the perimeter, just simple things like tripwires with cans to make noise. Part of me felt ridiculous, but another part of me couldn't ignore it. Then came the incident that made the fear real. I had gone down to the creek early in the morning to get water for coffee and breakfast. The forest was thick with fog, the sun just barely breaking through, giving everything a muted glow. As I bent down to fill my water bottle, I heard the sound of something moving in the underbrush behind me. I froze, listening. The sound was deliberate, too deliberate to be an animal. Snap of a branch, rustle of leaves, careful steps. I slowly turned my head, keeping my eyes on the shadows. Nothing was there, but the feeling didn't leave. I filled my bottle quickly, more slowly than necessary, and returned to the cabin. When I got inside, I locked the door, checked the windows, and realized the scuff marks near the back door were fresher, more defined. Someone had been there last night while I was asleep. I sat down, my hands shaking, heart pounding. It hit me fully then. This wasn't a story about isolation anymore. Someone had been following me, watching me, possibly waiting. The rest of that day, I tried to stay busy. I chopped firewood, stacked it carefully, cleaned the cabin, anything to distract myself. I stayed alert, listening for any sounds beyond the usual forest noises. Around noon, I thought I saw someone between the trees when I glanced out the window, but when I looked again, no one was there. I didn't know if it was paranoia or reality. By evening, I barely ate. I built a huge fire in the fireplace and sat close, the cabin feeling smaller and smaller, like the walls were closing in. The sun went down, the shadows stretched, and I heard the sounds again. Footsteps circling the cabin, careful and light, stopping when I stopped moving, resuming when I tried to ignore them. The first time I had felt truly unsafe in my life, my chest tightened, my mind spinning with possibilities I didn't want to consider. That night, I didn't sleep at all. Every sound, every rustle, every small crack made me jump. I kept checking the locks, listening at the windows. I realized the batteries on my flashlight were weak, and my phone had no signal. I was cut off, completely. The idea that I might have to face someone in the dark terrified me. I considered leaving immediately, but the forest paths in the dark were dangerous, treacherous, and I didn't even know which way led back to the main road. I had a knife in my backpack, but it didn't make me feel safer. I stayed awake all night, sitting on the couch with the fire low but steady, until dawn finally broke. The first morning light brought relief, though not safety. I decided then I couldn't stay another night. I packed everything into my car, careful and methodical, checking every window and door before I left. As I approached the car, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. Footprints around my car, not mine, circling it, large enough to be human. Someone had been here, waiting. I felt a rush of panic and adrenaline, my mind racing through options. but there was no choice. I got into the car, locked the doors, started the engine, and drove. The forest seemed alive around me, shadows stretching in ways that made the road seem endless. Every movement in the trees made me tense, heart racing. I drove faster than was safe, barely noticing the curves and turns, desperate to reach anything resembling civilization. Hours later, I finally emerged from the forest into the first small town. The streets were normal, people walking dogs, cars moving slowly, the world alive in a way that felt almost alien. I parked, breathed deeply, and called the police. They came out, took statements, and while they couldn't do much, they had no way to patrol the forest that far in. They noted the cabin had been broken into. Signs of someone living in the woods nearby, possibly watching for weeks. They said it wasn't safe and I couldn't go back. I didn't argue. I just wanted out. After that, I stayed with friends in the nearest city for a few days, unable to go back to my apartment in the city I had left, because every small noise, every shadow, every unfamiliar sound reminded me of the forest, the cabin, and the feeling of being hunted. Eventually, I returned home, but I changed. I learned to lock every door, check windows obsessively, and never underestimate the reality of other people's presence, even in places that feel completely isolated. I kept the memories of that trip like a scar, a reminder of how quickly safety can disappear when isolation turns from freedom into vulnerability. The cabin itself I never thought I would end up in a situation like that, but looking back, I can trace it all to one small, stupid decision. Deciding to go on a solo weekend trip to a cabin deep in the woods, far away from any town or cell service. I had found the cabin online. It was tucked in the middle of a dense forest, about 4 hours from the nearest city. The pictures showed a rustic wooden cabin, small but sturdy, with a stone fireplace, a tiny porch, and a clear view of the surrounding forest. I was drawn to the isolation, the idea of being completely alone with nothing but the sound of the wind through the trees and the occasional bird. I wanted quiet, a chance to escape the constant noise of work, of people, of life. But what I got was far from quiet in the way I had imagined. The drive there was uneventful at first. The highway stretched out long and straight, flanked by fields and small hills, the sun shining through the thin clouds. As I left the highway, the roads narrowed, the pavement giving way to gravel, then dirt. My small rental car bounced over rocks and potholes as I wound my way through narrow forest paths. The trees grew thicker, the light dimmer, and the silence more pronounced. There were no other cars, no houses, not even power lines. I felt an odd mixture of freedom and unease, a tingle in the back of my neck that I ignored. I told myself it was just the isolation playing tricks on me. I arrived at the cabin just before sunset. The air was cool, scented with pine and damp earth, the forest floor a tapestry of fallen leaves and needles. The cabin was even more charming in person than in the photos. The wood was dark and weathered, the roof covered with moss, and the small porch creaked slightly when I stepped on it. I unlocked the door, feeling the satisfying give of the old lock, and stepped inside. The air smelled faintly of wood polish and something faintly sour, like the mustiness of a place that had been closed up for a while. The interior was simple: a main room with a stone fireplace, a small kitchen area with a wood stove, a single bedroom, and a bathroom with a tiny shower. I unpacked my bags slowly, taking in the space, the quiet. I reminded myself to check the firewood pile outside. I wanted to make sure I could stay warm through the night. I started a small fire in the fireplace, the flames crackling and popping, the warmth spreading across the room. Outside, the sun had dipped below the treetops, leaving a dim, twilight haze. The forest seemed to exhale as the light faded, the shadows deepening into shapes that my mind instantly tried to assign meaning to. I had a bottle of water, some canned food, a flashlight, and a fully charged power bank. I felt prepared, but a low-level tension began to creep in, a sense of being watched that I couldn't shake. I blamed it on nerves and the isolation. Night fell quickly. The wind picked up, rustling the trees in a way that sounded almost like whispers. I kept telling myself it was just the wind, the branches rubbing together. But as I walked to the kitchen to pour myself a cup of tea, I noticed something odd. A faint crunching sound outside, as if someone or something was walking through the leaves. My first thought was a deer, then a raccoon, then, strangely, a human. I froze, listening. The sound stopped. I stood there, tense, my heart beating hard. I peered through the window, but all I could see was darkness, the shapes of trees shifting in the wind. I told myself it was probably a deer or a raccoon and went back to the fire. I tried to shake the feeling, but I couldn't fully dismiss it. Something about being completely alone made every sound sharper, every shadow suspicious. I went to bed early, thinking I would sleep deeply with the fire still burning in the fireplace. I left a small log smoldering, enough to keep the room warm. The wind howled outside, rattling the windows, and every creak of the cabin made me flinch. I lay there in the dark, listening. Then I heard it again. A crunch, a step on the porch, deliberate and slow. I held my breath. My mind raced through every possibility, and then it hit me. Someone could be outside. I grabbed the flashlight from my nightstand, shining it toward the window, and there, faintly illuminated by the moonlight, I saw a shadow. My stomach sank. I debated calling the police, but the cabin was deep in the woods, and I had no idea how long it would take for them to arrive. Panic surged through me, but I forced myself to stay calm. I needed a plan. I remembered that the cabin had a back door. Quietly, I slipped out of bed, careful not to make any noise, and grabbed the small hatchet I had packed for chopping wood. I crept to the door and peeked out. Nothing. The porch was empty, but the forest beyond was a black wall. I could hear faint noises, leaves rustling, branches snapping, but nothing concrete. I shone the flashlight around, catching nothing. My mind refused to accept what I wanted to believe, that I was completely alone. Hours passed. I sat by the fire, axe in hand, listening. Every sound made me jump. At one point, I thought I heard a low whisper, but there was no one there. I tried to remind myself that fear made your brain invent things, that it was just the wind, the trees, the isolation. But deep down, I knew that something wasn't right. Whoever or whatever was out there wasn't normal. The forest, usually comforting in its solitude, now felt like it was closing in, surrounding me with unknown threats. By morning, I was exhausted. I hadn't slept, hadn't eaten, barely moved from the chair by the fire. The night had been long, filled with imagined footsteps and fleeting shadows. But when I stepped outside, the world looked normal. The sun spilling through the trees, birds hopping along the forest floor, squirrels darting from branch to branch. I felt a rush of relief, thinking I had overreacted. Then I saw it. Footprints in the dirt, leading up to the porch and then disappearing into the forest. Human footprints. Someone had been here. I scanned the surrounding area, but there was no one in sight. The feeling of being watched returned, stronger than before. I decided to leave immediately. I packed my bag quickly, threw the fire into the fireplace to burn out, and locked the cabin. My plan was to drive back no matter what. As I walked to the car, I noticed something else. Fresh tire tracks in the dirt, leading off the road I had taken the day before. They were recent. Someone had followed me. My heart pounded. I jumped into the car, locked the doors, and started the engine. I told myself to stay calm, keep driving, and avoid the forest paths if possible. The drive back was tense. Every sound, the crunch of gravel under the tires, the rustle of leaves, made me flinch. I kept checking the rearview mirror, expecting to see headlights or shadows following me. Hours passed, and finally I reached the highway. Relief washed over me. The normal roads, the presence of other cars, the signs of civilization. It all grounded me. I kept driving until I reached a gas station, parked, and just sat there, letting my hands stop shaking. Looking back, I realized how unprepared I had been. The cabin had been isolated, yes, but the real danger wasn't the darkness or the wind. It was another person, someone who had been tracking me, possibly watching for hours, maybe even longer. I had underestimated the reality of being alone in the woods. I had imagined a peaceful retreat, but the isolation amplified the vulnerability. The sense that someone could enter your space unnoticed, that your safety depended on nothing but your vigilance. I didn't go back. I didn't report it immediately, though I considered it. The police had no leads, just my story and the vague description of footprints and tire tracks. I never found out who had been there, but the experience left me with a permanent wariness, a habit of checking locks, of listening to the forest differently. The isolation I had craved had been replaced with a lingering anxiety, a respect for the unpredictable nature of being alone, deep in the wilderness. In the months that followed, I spent time understanding what had happened. I realized I had ignored small signs, the way the dirt had seemed slightly disturbed when I arrived, the way the trees and shadows made certain sounds more noticeable. I started learning more about survival, about cabin security, about how to handle unexpected visitors when alone in remote areas. I became meticulous with plans, with communication, with leaving notes for anyone in case I went missing. The experience taught me that fear is not just in your mind. It can be a real, tangible presence, especially when someone else is out there, watching, waiting, and you are entirely alone. Eventually, I found a cabin retreat that was safe, with security measures and some distance from total isolation. I still go to the woods, still enjoy the quiet, but I never underestimate the potential for danger again. I carry a small hatchet, a whistle, pepper spray, and always leave my location with someone. The fear never fully leaves, but I use it now as preparation, as awareness. The experience was terrifying, but it gave me a I had been planning this trip for months. The cabin sat far back from the nearest road, tucked into a stretch of forest that seemed endless. I had driven for hours, leaving the small town behind, the roads narrowing and then vanishing into gravel paths lined by dense pine and oak. I wanted isolation, the kind of solitude that forced you to be completely alone with yourself. My car rattled over roots and stones as I climbed the last mile to the cabin, and when I finally parked, the air smelled of damp soil and rotting leaves, a pungent mix that told me the forest was alive and waiting. The cabin itself was smaller than I imagined, a wooden structure that looked like it had survived decades of weather. Its shingles were worn, some missing entirely, and the wood was darkened by rain and sun. I opened the creaking door and stepped inside. Dust clung to everything, and the floorboards groaned under my weight. The main room had a small fireplace, long cold and empty, and a few chairs with torn fabric. A thin layer of grime covered the table, and I could see the remnants of old food and broken glass. It smelled like the memory of people had been trapped there, like the house was holding on to them. I dropped my bag near the wall and walked around, running my hand along the rough wood. The walls were bare, except for a few shelves with old cans and jars, some broken, some half full of food I wouldn't dare touch. There was a small bedroom with a bed that sagged under what I imagined was decades of neglect. The mattress was stained, and the sheets were thin, yellowed, and torn. I decided I wouldn't sleep in that bed. I had a sleeping bag, and I unrolled it on the floor, thinking it would at least give me some comfort against the cold. The first night was uneventful, in a way. I had a small fire going, the kind you have to feed constantly to keep alive. It sputtered and crackled, shadows dancing along the walls in patterns that made the cabin feel alive in its own strange way. Outside, the wind shook the branches, making a constant rustling sound that filled the otherwise complete silence. I lay on the floor, staring at the ceiling, and tried to read, but my eyes kept drifting to the window. The darkness beyond seemed to have weight, as if the forest was pressing down on the glass. The second day, I went to explore the surrounding forest. The cabin was near a small stream that cut through the trees. The water was clear but cold, running over stones and twisting around fallen logs. I walked upstream, watching for tracks or signs of animals. Deer had passed through recently, I could tell from the prints, and there were small burrows that might belong to foxes or rabbits. I walked for hours, my boots sinking into mud in some places, my arms scratched by low-hanging branches in others. I found a small clearing where the sun broke through the canopy, and I sat for a long time just listening. The silence was immense, almost painful. I realized I hadn't seen another person in hours. When I returned, the cabin looked different. Not physically different, but somehow heavier, as if my absence had allowed the house to settle into its own rhythm without me. I checked the supplies I had brought: food, water, matches, a small first aid kit. Everything seemed fine, but I felt a subtle unease I couldn't name. The wind had picked up, rattling the cabin in small, unpredictable ways. At night, it sounded like someone was moving through the branches outside. I kept reminding myself it was just wind, just the forest, but the sound had a pattern that didn't make sense. Sharp, deliberate cracks that weren't the usual creaking of wood. By the third night, the unease had grown. I woke several times to noises: scraping, thumps, and the occasional heavy branch hitting the ground. The cabin's windows rattled, and the shadows seemed deeper than they should have been. I checked my small flashlight and my pocket knife, trying to convince myself that I was prepared for anything. I knew I was alone, and I knew that whatever was out there wasn't supernatural. That thought was supposed to be comforting, but it wasn't. Something about knowing the forest could hurt me in real, physical ways was far more frightening than any ghost story. On the fourth day, I decided to explore the area more carefully. I found a small path that looked like it had been used recently. The footprints were too large for deer, and they didn't look like any animal tracks I had seen. They were human. The realization hit me hard. Someone had been near the cabin, and judging by the prints, they had passed very recently. My stomach tightened, and I walked the path, trying to decide if I should follow it or return. The prints disappeared after a short distance, leading only into the thickest part of the forest, where the light barely reached the ground. I went back to the cabin as quickly as I could, constantly listening for any sounds behind me. That night was worse. The wind had died down, but the sounds had not. I could hear scratching at the door, faint and intermittent, like someone testing the lock. I gripped my knife and stayed close to the fire. My mind kept racing. Maybe it was an animal, a raccoon or a bear, but the sound didn't match anything I had heard before. It was methodical, careful. Couldn't sleep at all. Every crack of wood, every rustle in the leaves outside made me sit up, straining to hear what was happening. By the time dawn arrived, I was exhausted, my muscles sore from tension and lack of rest. The fifth day, I prepared to leave. I packed my things quickly, leaving the cabin as intact as I could. I didn't want to see whatever had been out there again, and I didn't want to linger. As I stepped outside, I noticed something I hadn't before. Footprints in the mud near the cabin, large, heavy, and unmistakably human. They were fresh, and they led straight into the forest. My heart pounded. Whoever it was had been there while I slept, just out of sight, watching. I didn't stop to think. I ran to my car, my boots sinking into the mud, branches tearing at my jacket, adrenaline giving me speed I didn't know I had. When I finally reached the road, I didn't slow down. The thought of the forest behind me was unbearable. I drove for hours without stopping, checking the rearview mirror every few minutes. The sun had risen fully, and yet the memory of those prints and the noises from the night before made my skin crawl. When I finally reached the town, I parked, shut off the engine, and just sat there, breathing heavily, the reality of what had happened pressing down on me. I never went back to that cabin. I reported the footprints to the local ranger station, and they told me they had seen signs of a trespasser in the area before, though no one had ever been caught. The thought that someone had been in that cabin, watching me, living in the forest so close yet hidden, stayed with me for weeks. I kept thinking about how easy it would have been for them to do something worse, how little I would have known until it was too late. Eventually, the fear eased, replaced by a cautious respect for the isolation I had sought. The forest was no longer just peaceful and quiet in my mind. It had depth and danger I hadn't understood before. I realized that solitude carries risk, not just from the environment, but from the unknown people who might share it with you. That lesson stayed with me far longer than the scratches on my jacket or the memory of the cold, dark cabin ever could. I kept a closer eye on maps and rangers' reports before any solo trips after that. I learned to check for signs of human activity, to carry more than one method of communication, to trust my instincts when the silence feels too heavy. I never thought I would be scared of a cabin in the woods, but that experience reshaped how I approached nature forever. The forest wasn't forgiving, and neither were the people who might hide in it. Awareness became survival, and from that point on, I carried it with me everywhere. I had been planning the trip for months. After a long stretch of work and city life that wore me down more than I could put into words, I needed a place that was isolated, quiet, and untouched. The cabin I rented was deep in a forest that most maps barely showed. It was a small wooden structure, old but sturdy, perched near the edge of a narrow clearing that met the edge of a lake. The GPS signal faded long before I got to the final turn, and the last half hour was guided entirely by a dirt path barely wide enough for a single car. My mind was buzzing with the anticipation of complete solitude and the escape it promised. When I arrived, the late afternoon sun was slipping behind the thick line of trees. The cabin looked even smaller in person, with its weathered wooden siding, moss growing along the roof, and a chimney that didn't appear to have been used in years. I parked the car on a patch of flattened grass and stepped out, stretching and taking in the smell of damp earth and pine. I could hear the lake in the distance, the quiet lapping of water against the shore, and somewhere far off, a bird cawed or maybe a crow. The silence was heavy, different from city silence. It felt almost physical, pressing against my ears and chest. The cabin's door creaked as I pushed it open. Inside, it smelled like aged wood and dust, the kind of smell that makes you want to cough but also feel grounded. The interior was small, a main room with a stone fireplace, a tiny kitchen area with cupboards that rattled when touched, and a narrow staircase that led to a loft above. A bed, a chair, and a table were all that furnished the space. Light from the windows painted long shadows across the floor, and I felt a strange mix of excitement and unease. I set down my bag, took a deep breath, and reminded myself why I was there. To be alone, to breathe, to escape the constant hum of the city. I spent the first couple of hours unpacking, organizing, and walking around the small property. The lake was still just visible through the trees, the water calm and reflecting the dimming sky. The forest pressed in on all sides. The nearest other cabin was at least a mile away, hidden among thick clusters of pines and oaks. By nightfall, the forest became a wall of darkness, and the only light came from the cabin's lantern and the moon that barely filtered through the thick canopy. I went to bed early, worn out from the drive and the adrenaline of reaching this remote place. Sleep came slowly. Even with the thick darkness pressing on me, the quiet felt alive, almost suffocating in its stillness. Branches scraped the sides of the cabin, the wind shifted, and somewhere nearby, small animals scurried in the underbrush. At first, these sounds were natural, and I told myself they were just animals. But then, I started to hear other noises, ones that didn't belong to the forest. A soft, almost deliberate knocking on the side of the cabin, faint footsteps crunching in the distance, too rhythmic to be random. I stayed awake most of the night. Every small sound was amplified. I checked the windows repeatedly, each time finding nothing except shadows of trees swaying. My mind tried to rationalize everything. The wind, small animals, maybe a branch falling. But the instinctive tension in my chest refused to let me relax. By morning, exhaustion had replaced fear, but the unease lingered. I decided to take a long walk around the area, hoping daylight would calm my nerves. I walked along the lake, noting how isolated the place truly was. There were no paths, no signs of other humans for miles. The forest floor was damp, covered in moss, pine needles, and fallen branches that sometimes snapped loudly under my boots. I moved carefully, scanning the surroundings, aware that isolation brings a certain clarity and a certain paranoia. That afternoon, I returned to the cabin and decided to explore inside more thoroughly. In one of the drawers in the kitchen, I found old notebooks and a journal. The pages were yellowed and brittle, filled with lists, sketches, and personal notes from the cabin's previous inhabitant. It mentioned daily routines, observations of wildlife, and occasional reflections about solitude. At first, it was comforting to see someone else had lived here in peace. But then, as I read further, the entries became more erratic. The handwriting got messier, the notes more fragmented. There were comments about hearing footsteps at night, shadows moving across the cabin when no one was there, and strange sounds coming from the trees. My stomach tightened as I realized the isolation itself was what had unnerved the previous occupant. That night, the noises returned, stronger and closer. Something moved around the cabin, not the irregular steps of animals, but something with weight and intent. I stayed in the loft, trying to stay quiet, listening as it circled the building. I knew the cabin wasn't locked securely, and I felt the foolishness of being so far away from help. Every instinct screamed at me to leave, but the darkness outside and the unknown of the forest made it impossible to see what I would be running into. I stayed awake until dawn, when the forest seemed to finally fall silent, leaving only the usual sounds of birds and wind. I couldn't ignore the tension any longer. I spent the next day examining the property for possible entrances and exits, finding some small windows I hadn't noticed before. I reinforced what I could, nailing boards over weak spots and moving furniture to block access points. Even with these precautions, the unease remained, a constant pressure at the back of my mind. I had expected solitude, but this was different. This was isolation that felt like it was pressing in, watching, waiting. The next night, I decided to stay in the main room instead of the loft. The noises began again, the steps, the tapping, the faint scraping along the siding. I sat against the wall, knees drawn up, flashlight in hand, imagining all the possibilities of what could be out there. Hours passed. Nothing appeared to break through the walls, but the tension was unrelenting. My mind began to notice patterns. Footsteps always stopping at the corners, tapping always following the rhythm of my breathing, as though someone or something was aware of me. It wasn't supernatural, but it was terrifying in its reality. Someone could be out there watching, testing, waiting. The third night, I stayed vigilant. I noticed faint marks near the back window, almost as if someone had tried to peer in or make contact. My heart raced. I realized I wasn't just alone in the forest. I was alone, and someone else might know it. I considered leaving, but the forest was thick and dark. The path I had come along nearly impossible to follow safely in darkness. I decided to stay put, reinforcing the door as best as I could, making makeshift barricades, and preparing for the long night. Hours passed, each minute stretching impossibly long. The tapping started again, lighter this time, almost playful in rhythm. My hands trembled as I held the flashlight, scanning the edges of the cabin. Then, I heard a sound different from before. A faint rustling behind a line of trees, followed by heavy breathing, deliberate and steady. I froze, trying to make no sound. It became clear that I was being watched, studied, and that whoever or whatever was out there knew I was terrified. Dawn finally came, painting the forest in muted gold light. I saw nothing outside, but I noticed footprints in the damp soil that hadn't been there before. Human footprints, large, uneven, circling the cabin during the night. The realization hit me. I had been alone in my mind for so long, imagining fear, but there were real threats here. Not wild animals, not supernatural forces, just human beings who had come close enough to unsettle me without revealing themselves fully. After breakfast, I made a plan. I gathered supplies, packed my belongings, and waited until midday when the forest was bright. I started walking along the dirt path I had driven in on, keeping my eyes and ears alert. The footprints continued along the edge of the trees, but I saw no one. My pace quickened. The forest seemed to grow denser, the shadows heavier, but the thought of reaching the road pushed me forward. By late afternoon, I finally reached a familiar landmark I had passed on the way in. My car was waiting, exactly where I had left it, but the sight of it brought only temporary relief. As I drove back toward the nearest town, the tension began to ease slowly, though the memories of the nights in that cabin would stay with me forever. I realized that isolation, even when sought after, carries dangers that are not always obvious, and that fear is often born from the simplest, most human truths. That someone else might be watching, and you may have no way to defend yourself. I never returned to that cabin, and I never sought isolation in such a remote place again. But I kept the journal I had found, a reminder of how fragile solitude can be and how quickly safety can turn into vulnerability. Over time, I learned to respect the silence, the isolation, and the forest, not as a place of peace alone, but as a place where caution and awareness are as necessary as the air you breathe. Looking back, the experience shaped me. I became more aware of my surroundings. I had been planning the trip for months, and I thought I had everything perfectly organized. The cabin was located deep in the mountains, far from any main road or sign of human activity. I had always been drawn to these kinds of remote places, the kind where cell service disappeared without warning, where you could hear yourself breathe and feel like the world had disappeared around you. I imagined myself there alone, the isolation calming, almost meditative. But as I would soon discover, solitude can also be suffocating. I arrived late in the afternoon. The dirt road leading to the cabin was rough, riddled with potholes and twisted by tree roots that pushed through the surface. My car strained up the incline, tires crunching over loose stones. By the time I reached the small clearing where the cabin sat, surrounded by dense pines, the sun was already lowering behind the mountains. Its rays sliced through the trees in golden beams, casting long, uneven shadows on the forest floor. The cabin was small, made of dark wood, with a single stone chimney that looked like it hadn't been used in years. Its windows reflected the fading light, giving it an almost watchful look. I parked my car and stepped out. The air was crisp, carrying the smell of wet pine and the distant dampness of decaying leaves. I breathed deeply, letting the smell settle in my lungs, calming my nerves as I grabbed my bags. The door creaked loudly as I opened it. Inside, the cabin smelled of old wood, dust, and something faintly metallic, like iron. The interior was sparse. A small kitchen area with a stove, a wooden table, a couple of chairs, and a lofted bed in the corner. I set my bags down and took stock. There was firewood stacked neatly near the hearth and a small pile of supplies in one corner. A metal bucket near the sink suggested some form of water system, though I wasn't sure if it worked. I ran my hand over the table. It was rough and scratched, the kind of wear that comes from decades of use. Everything felt heavy, permanent, like the cabin itself was aware of its isolation and didn't intend to let anything disturb it. I decided to get a fire going. The stove needed kindling, so I dragged a few logs over, stacked them carefully, and struck a match. The flame caught, sputtered, and finally roared to life. The warmth of the fire spread through the cabin slowly, chasing away the chill that had settled in my bones. I unpacked some food and water, setting it neatly on the table. As I worked, I noticed the quiet outside. The usual forest sounds, the rustle of wind through leaves, the chirping of birds, the distant bark of some unseen animal were muted. It wasn't the complete silence of the forest. It was more like the forest was holding its breath. It made my skin prickle, but I pushed the thought aside. I told myself it was just evening settling in. Night fell fast. Once the sun disappeared completely, the forest became a mass of shadows. I stood at the cabin window, looking out into the blackness. The trees swayed slightly, though there was little wind, their branches scraping against each other with a dry, whispering sound. The moonlight, pale and thin, barely lit the forest floor. I could see the shape of rocks and the occasional fallen branch, but beyond that, it was impossible to know what lay in the darkness. I felt the first twinge of unease. Being alone was one thing. Being watched, even by the forest itself, was another. I went to bed early, hoping a few hours of sleep would calm me. The loft was steep, accessed by a narrow wooden ladder. The mattress was thin, but firm, and the blanket smelled faintly of must and smoke. I lay down, staring at the ceiling beams. Every small creak of the cabin sounded magnified. The floorboards below me groaned as the cabin settled, or perhaps as some small animal scuttled about in the walls. I told myself it was just the old building shifting. Sleep came fitfully. At some point, I woke to a sound that made my heart thump against my ribs. It was a scratching, soft at first, almost rhythmic. I froze, listening. The noise came from the back of the cabin, near the storage area. My rational mind raced through possibilities. A raccoon, a squirrel, maybe a snake. But the sound was too deliberate, too constant to be a passing animal. I got out of bed carefully, trying not to make a sound. My bare feet hit the wooden floor, and the scratching stopped immediately. I stopped too, straining to hear. Nothing. The cabin was silent again. I felt my pulse hammering, my body cold despite the fire that still burned in the stove. I went back to bed, telling myself I had imagined it. The next morning, I woke early. The fire had burned low, leaving only embers that glowed faintly. I ate a quick breakfast and decided to explore the surrounding area. The forest was still thick, the trees growing close together, their roots tangled across the ground like the veins of some immense, buried creature. I followed a narrow trail that led down a slope toward a stream I had spotted from the cabin. The water was clear, cold, and fast-moving. I knelt to drink, cupping my hands and letting the icy liquid splash over my fingers. As I drank, I felt a presence behind me. I whipped around, but there was nothing, just the forest, silent except for the babbling of the stream. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone, or something, had been watching me. Back at the cabin, I checked the doors and windows. They were all intact, latched properly, nothing out of place. But the sense of unease lingered. I tried to busy myself, gathering firewood, chopping logs, arranging supplies. Each time I looked outside, I half expected to see a figure among the trees, but there was never anything. The days passed slowly. I kept a schedule. Gather wood, cook, clean, explore nearby areas, and return before nightfall. But even during the day, the forest felt like it had eyes. Shadows moved where there should be none, and the wind carried strange sounds that made me jerk my head around. The second night was worse. I had gone to bed early again, the fire dying down to embers. I was lying in the loft, staring at the ceiling, when I heard it, heavy footsteps outside. They weren't the soft padding of an animal, but deliberate, slow steps, crunching over the leaves and branches. I held my breath, heart hammering. The steps circled the cabin. Pause. Footsteps on the roof. Pause. Footsteps back on the ground. I felt trapped, completely exposed in the loft, with only a thin ladder between me and the unknown outside. I considered climbing out a window, but the drop would have been dangerous. I stayed frozen, listening, counting the steps. They stopped suddenly, leaving only the distant rustling of the forest. I waited hours, but sleep never came. By the third day, I was on edge. My hands shook while chopping wood, and I jumped at every snap of a twig or shift of a branch. I decided to inspect the perimeter of the cabin more carefully. I discovered faint tracks in the dirt, prints that were too large and heavy to belong to any deer or bear I knew of. They were human. My stomach twisted. Someone had been walking around the cabin while I slept, possibly while I explored. The realization hit me like ice water. I was not alone. Not by accident and not by curiosity. I had an intruder. I spent the day reinforcing the doors, barricading windows with chairs and wood planks, and keeping the fire going to make the cabin look occupied. I moved slowly, trying not to make noise. When night came again, I stayed awake, crouched on the floor near the fire, an old axe in my hands. The steps came again, this time circling slower, deliberate. The intruder walked the perimeter, whispering or muttering to himself, though the words were indistinct. I could feel him testing the doors, pressing on the wood and metal, looking for weakness. Hours passed. The intruder finally left, disappearing into the forest with no other sound but the occasional breaking of a branch. By the fourth day, I realized I could not stay. The cabin, once my refuge, had become a trap. I gathered what I could, packed my bags, and planned my escape. Daylight was my ally. I chose a route through the forest that kept me off the main road, hoping the intruder would not follow. My legs ached from the uneven terrain, and every rustle in the bushes made me flinch. Hours passed, and I stumbled over roots and rocks, moving as silently as possible. When I finally broke through the tree line, I reached the dirt road and saw a distant figure walking toward the cabin. I did not stop to watch. I ran, my legs burning, until I reached the nearest town. I called the authorities, gave them the cabin's location, and described the intruder. They came, investigated, and found signs of someone camping out in the woods near the cabin. There was no confrontation, no dramatic chase. The intruder had melted into the forest as if he had been waiting for me to leave. I was lucky, that was all. The cabin was abandoned again, but I would never return. What I had once seen as a peaceful retreat had shown me another. I had been planning this trip for months, telling myself that a week alone in the mountains would be a chance to disconnect, to reset, to find some peace in the quiet. The cabin was nothing fancy, just a small, rustic structure a few miles off the main dirt road that wound through the forested slopes. It had electricity and a wood stove, but no internet, no phone signal, no distractions beyond the view and the wind through the pines. I had imagined mornings with coffee steaming in the cold air, evenings watching the sky darken and listening to the wind whistling through the trees. I had imagined feeling calm, or at least alone in the way that was rare in my life. The first day went almost exactly as I had hoped. The drive up the winding road was long, the tires crunching over gravel and loose rocks. The higher I went, the denser the forest became, pine trees and firs stretching tall and dark. When I finally pulled up in front of the cabin, the air was already sharp and cold, and the sky was a deep, heavy gray. I carried my bags inside, lit the stove, and unpacked. There was a small kitchen, a living area with 2 armchairs and a couch, a bedroom with a heavy wooden bed, and a bathroom with a shower that ran warm. Nothing fancy, but more than adequate. I stacked firewood by the stove and made myself a simple meal. I felt a deep satisfaction in the simplicity. The second day I hiked. The trails were muddy from a recent rain, and my boots sank slightly with each step, pulling at my ankles. The forest was quiet except for the occasional call of a bird or the distant crack of a branch under some unseen animal's weight. I walked for hours, following a stream up a slope, until I reached a small clearing with rocks worn smooth by water. I sat there, listening to the water and wind, thinking about how far I was from anyone else. The isolation was exactly what I had wanted. And yet, as I traced my fingers over the rough stone and watched the water flow, I felt a creeping sense of being watched. At first, I tried to dismiss it. It was silly. I had seen deer tracks near the cabin, small animals everywhere. Maybe a fox or a coyote had hidden in the trees. But the feeling didn't go away. It grew heavier as the sun dropped lower, painting the sky with muted oranges and grays. The forest suddenly seemed larger, deeper, as though it extended forever beyond the clearing. I started back down, trying to tell myself I was imagining things, that the fear was coming from fatigue and hunger. When I got back to the cabin, the wind had picked up. The trees leaned and groaned, and the windows rattled in their frames. I checked the stove and fed the fire, trying to get the warmth back into the room. I ate quickly, then sat near the window listening. The sound of branches scraping, leaves rustling, and distant snapping made me restless. My eyes kept darting to the dark edges of the forest, half expecting to see movement. Nothing came. I told myself to sleep, to let the night pass. Night in the cabin was different from night in a house in town. Every sound seemed louder, sharper, more threatening. The wind howled through the trees, and the cabin walls creaked in response. At one point, I heard a sharp knock at the door. My heart jumped, and I froze. Another knock came, softer, almost tentative. I stared at the door, trying to find a rational explanation. Maybe a branch had fallen and hit it. Maybe some animal. But the timing felt deliberate. I gripped a heavy kitchen knife, and after a tense few minutes with no further noise, I forced myself to calm down. The knocks had stopped. I slept in short bursts, waking whenever the wind shifted or branches scraped the cabin walls. I kept the knife near my bed. The next morning, I found marks on the porch floor, faint scratches that had not been there before, small but enough to make me uneasy. I went about the day, chopping firewood, hiking a short distance from the cabin, making sure to leave marks of my own along the path. I tried to convince myself I was being paranoid, but the following night it escalated. I had gone to bed earlier, exhausted from the hike, and around midnight, I woke to a sound I couldn't immediately identify. At first, it was subtle, a soft crunching near the cabin. I froze, straining my ears. The wind had died down, leaving only the sound of footsteps outside. Slow, deliberate steps that circled the cabin. My stomach dropped. I could see nothing outside, the windows dark and reflective. My hands shook as I gripped the knife. Hours passed like that, me pressed against the bed, listening. The footsteps moved from one side of the cabin to the other, then paused, then continued. At one point, I heard a faint scraping sound at the back door. The lock was old, rusted, and I feared it could give way under pressure. I thought about trying to escape, but the forest was dark, thick, and unfamiliar. Even if I ran, I might get lost, injured, or worse. I had no phone signal, no way to call for help. I realized I was completely at the mercy of whoever or whatever was outside. By the time dawn came, I was trembling, exhausted, and paranoid. I peered out the windows carefully, seeing no one. Just the forest, silent again, but now loaded with threat. I knew I had to make a plan. Staying in the cabin without any idea who was out there was no longer an option. I gathered supplies: water, some food, a flashlight, and my knife. I mapped out a path down the main dirt road, one I had driven on the way in. I intended to leave at first light, hoping the person outside had retreated with the darkness. As I walked through the woods, the sun rising behind me, I noticed footprints. Not animal tracks, but boot prints in the mud. They were too large and spaced for any animal I knew. My heart hammered, and I quickened my pace, keeping to the shadows, moving quietly, trying to remain unseen. Each snap of a twig underfoot made me flinch. I forced myself to stay focused, to follow the dirt road. Hours passed. I avoided leaving obvious marks, trying to obscure my path. At one point, I had to cross a small creek. The water was cold and fast, but I forced myself through, feeling the current tug at my boots. On the other side, I froze. A figure stood at the edge of the woods, watching. They were motionless, dark against the lighter background of the trees. My stomach dropped and I froze. Then, without a sound, they turned and vanished into the forest. I didn't follow. I ran. By mid-afternoon, I finally reached a clearing where the dirt road intersected with a slightly larger gravel road. I saw a car passing in the distance and waved frantically, hoping they would see me. The car slowed, then stopped. I ran the last 100 feet, exhausted, and collapsed near the vehicle. The driver was an older man who immediately called the sheriff for me. I told him everything: the footsteps, the marks, the night spent terrified, the figure in the woods. The man didn't flinch but nodded seriously, calling in to confirm help. The sheriff arrived within the hour. They scoured the area around the cabin, taking photos of footprints, the porch scratches, and other disturbances. There was no sign of the person I had seen, but enough evidence to suggest someone had been watching the cabin, possibly for days. They advised me to stay in town at a motel until the area was secure. Over the next few days, I returned to the cabin with deputies. They reinforced the locks, checked the surrounding woods for signs of repeated intrusion, and installed a temporary security system. They couldn't catch the intruder, but they documented everything and gave me guidance for safely returning. I stayed longer than I had originally planned, cautiously rebuilding trust with the environment, retracing my steps in daylight, inspecting every window and door before setting foot inside. When I finally left, I felt a mixture of relief and accomplishment. I had faced a very real danger, not a ghost or a storybook figure, but a human threat, and I had survived. The cabin still stood, silent, unassuming, but the forest seemed different now, a place where shadows could hide real threats. I realized the importance of preparation, awareness, and trust in instinct. I returned home, carrying not only the memory of fear but a deeper understanding of caution and survival, and the certainty that while the forest was beautiful, it was not forgiving. From that experience, I learned to respect isolation and the unknown, to prepare for every possibility, and to listen to my instincts when they screamed that something was wrong. The cabin trip had been terrifying, but it ended with me safe, wiser, and fully aware that real danger is rarely seen coming, and survival depends on attention, courage, and careful planning. I had been planning this trip for months. The idea of leaving the city behind, of shutting myself off from the constant noise and obligations, had grown into a sort of obsession over the last year. I wanted complete isolation, a place where the world felt distant and I could be alone with my thoughts. The cabin I rented was somewhere deep in the woods of northern Idaho, far from roads, far from people. When I drove up the narrow dirt trail leading to it, I realized how remote it really was. The trees pressed in from both sides, their trunks thick and gnarled, the canopy above so dense that sunlight barely reached the ground. Every mile further into the forest seemed to make the world behind me vanish completely, and a quiet unease began to settle in my stomach, though I tried to push it aside. I told myself it was just excitement, just anticipation. The cabin itself was old, though solid. Weathered logs, darkened with age, and a roof that sagged slightly in the center. There was a small porch with peeling paint on the railing, and the windows were clouded, making it impossible to see inside. The first thing I noticed was the smell. A mix of damp wood, mildew, and the faint but unmistakable odor of decay from leaves and debris that had collected over years. I parked the car and stepped onto the porch, feeling the boards creak beneath my weight. I had expected this cabin to be empty, abandoned in a sense, but there was something strange about it. The door was unlocked. Inside, the cabin was small but functional. A single room that served as living area, with a kitchenette along one wall and a rough wooden table in the center. A stone fireplace dominated one corner, its interior blackened with soot from fires long ago. Beyond the main room was a tiny bedroom with a thin mattress on a wooden frame, and a bathroom that smelled faintly of rust and stagnant water. There was no running water, no electricity beyond a single flickering lantern I found in a corner. I set my backpack down and let my eyes sweep the room, trying to reconcile the quiet beauty of this place with the creeping sense of unease gnawing at me. The first night was hard. The silence was complete, not the soft, comforting silence of a quiet room or a gentle evening, but the kind of silence that presses against your ears and makes every small noise, every creak of the cabin settling, feel exaggerated. Outside, the wind rustled through the trees, and occasionally, the distant sound of a branch snapping made me jump. I tried to sleep, but every shadow in the corners of the room seemed to grow larger, darker, moving slightly when I wasn't looking. I kept telling myself it was my imagination, the result of being alone, the result of being so far from anyone else. Eventually, exhaustion won, and I drifted into a restless, dreamless sleep. The next morning, I woke to the sound of birds, sharp and shrill, moving among the trees outside. I brewed coffee over a small camping stove I had brought and sat on the porch, looking out at the forest. The trail that led here was nothing more than a narrow gap between trees, winding its way down toward the nearest road, miles away. The further I looked into the forest, the darker it became. The trees were close together, their trunks thick, their branches tangled. I realized quickly that once you went beyond a certain point, the undergrowth made walking almost impossible. That knowledge, simple as it was, made the isolation feel real in a way I hadn't fully grasped until now. I spent the next day exploring the immediate area around the cabin. The ground was damp, moss covering rocks and fallen logs. Small streams wound their way through the trees, water clear but cold and fast-moving. I marked paths with small stacks of stones, aware that if I wandered too far, I could easily get lost. By late afternoon, I returned to the cabin, exhausted and wet from a sudden drizzle that had soaked through my jacket. I started a fire in the fireplace, the smoke curling up the chimney, and settled down to eat a small meal I had brought. Canned beans, some bread, and a few apples. The light from the fire flickered against the walls, and the shadows seemed to move in ways that made my skin crawl. I had read enough survival stories, enough news accounts of people getting trapped in the woods, to know that fear was often the most dangerous thing out here. The second night was worse. The wind had picked up outside, and every sound was magnified in the stillness of the cabin. Branches scraped against the roof and walls, and I was certain I could hear footsteps outside the door, light at first, then heavier, deliberate. I stayed close to the fireplace, my eyes darting to every corner of the room, every window, imagining shapes in the darkness. At one point, I thought I heard something brushing against the side of the cabin, and I froze. My heart pounded, and I told myself I would go check in the morning. I couldn't bring myself to look that night. The fear was thick, almost physical, pressing against my chest. The morning brought no relief. I stepped outside, the cold air stinging my face, and looked around. Nothing. No tracks, no signs of anyone or anything having been near. I walked the perimeter of the cabin, looking for fallen branches or footprints in the mud. There were none, and yet the feeling didn't go away. I couldn't shake it, no matter how logical I tried to be. I was alone, I told myself. I was safe. But that alone, that complete isolation, was itself unnerving. I spent the day gathering firewood, keeping my mind busy, trying to convince myself I was simply overreacting. By the third day, the fear had begun to take a toll. I was sleeping less, moving more slowly, feeling constantly on edge. Every small noise made me jump. Every shadow made me tense. I started noticing things I hadn't before. Small scratches on the porch railings, not deep enough to be from a large animal, more like claws, small and thin. Twigs broken near the cabin, as if someone or something had brushed against them. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe deer, maybe raccoons, but the patterns didn't match what I knew about local wildlife. The scratches were higher than a raccoon could reach, and the broken branches didn't look like what a deer would leave. I remember the drive to the cabin clearly, even now, months later, because it was one of the last times I felt completely free. It was a long, winding stretch of road, miles of asphalt that cut through thick forest on both sides. The air had that sharp, clean smell you only get far from the city, mixed with damp earth and pine sap. I had packed everything I thought I would need for the week: food, water, clothes, a first aid kit, a small toolkit, and a heavy flashlight with extra batteries. The cabin itself was far off the main road, down a narrow dirt track that grew over with roots and moss, the kind of road where you had to drive slow or risk scraping your undercarriage. My phone had already lost signal an hour into the drive, which I welcomed. No interruptions, no calls, no emails, just me and the forest. The cabin wasn't new, but it was solid, made of thick logs with chinking between them, a steep roof with dark shingles, and a small porch that had weathered boards and a single swinging chair. It had a wood-burning stove inside, a stone fireplace, and all the basic furniture you might need. There was a small kitchen area with a sink and counter, an old refrigerator that hummed when plugged in, and a couple of shelves stocked with canned food that the previous owner had left behind. I had found the cabin through a short-term rental site. Pictures made it look cozy, almost inviting. In reality, it had a rough edge, a kind of wildness that made me feel like the forest hadn't yet surrendered it to human hands. The first night, I unpacked my things slowly, making sure everything was in place, and lit a fire in the stove. Outside, the wind rattled the trees, and I felt a quiet thrill in being completely alone. The first day was simple. I explored the small area around the cabin, taking notes of nearby trails, a tiny stream that ran a few hundred meters behind the property, and the steep hill that loomed to the north. I collected some dry wood for the stove and stacked it by the cabin wall, making sure it was within easy reach. Everything was methodical, deliberate. I wanted to be prepared. The air smelled richer here, filled with wet leaves and moss and that faint decay that you only notice when you're truly away from civilization. At night, the forest was alive. Birds, distant rustles of movement, maybe deer or other small animals. I slept lightly, waking at odd times to the distant snap of a branch or the quiet thump of something hitting the ground. The second day, I hiked further. There was a ridge about 2 miles from the cabin that overlooked a small valley. The trail was overgrown, littered with fallen branches and mud. I had worn my boots, thick socks, and carried a small backpack with water, some granola bars, a compass, and a map I had printed at home. Hiking felt good, felt necessary. The forest was dense, the trees tall and old. Moss grew thick along their trunks, and the air had that wet, heavy weight that made the forest feel both alive and threatening. I passed no one, not a single other person, and by the time I reached the ridge, I felt the first real stir of unease. Being alone in such vast quiet made me acutely aware of the sounds. The wind, the creak of trees, the occasional rustle of leaves. But there was nothing tangible, nothing that could cause real harm. Not yet. That night, the first real storm arrived. I was used to rain, used to storms at home, but this was different. The wind was stronger here, carrying the smell of wet soil and pine deeper into the cabin. Rain pounded against the roof in uneven sheets, leaking slightly through a few old shingles. I sat near the stove, reading a book, listening to the sound of the forest being washed clean, or maybe being drowned. The first time I heard the scraping noise, I froze. It was outside, just beyond the porch. Something scraping against the wood, low and deliberate. I told myself it was a branch, but even as I reasoned that, I noticed the shadows moving differently, as if something larger had shifted behind the trees. I checked the windows. The rain blurred everything beyond a few feet. I stayed up the rest of the night, occasionally checking the door, keeping the fire burning. The following days, I stuck close to the cabin. My supplies were enough, and I made small improvements. Bailing water that had collected near the porch, stacking extra firewood, and making sure the doors and windows were properly shut and locked. The isolation felt heavier as the storm continued. Power lines were non-existent. My generator could only do so much. I had a small radio, but it only picked up static. Even when the storm paused briefly, the forest seemed quieter than before, as if waiting. It was the third night that things escalated. The scraping came again, louder this time, closer, like metal against wood, or claws against the log walls. I grabbed the flashlight and a kitchen knife, moving slowly toward the porch. The rain had stopped, leaving a thick mist hanging low over the ground. I could barely see, but I could hear it clearly now. Footsteps, uneven, deliberate, moving around the cabin. I didn't move outside. Couldn't. I stayed in the corner, listening, trying to reason. Animals don't do this. Bears avoid humans when they can. Wolves hunt in packs and rarely approach a single person so boldly. Whatever it wasn't just passing through. It was waiting. The night passed in a blur of fear and anticipation. Every sound made me tense. Every shadow seemed to stretch across the walls. I barely slept. By morning, the mist had lifted, and the sun was weak but present. Outside, I found marks in the dirt. Large footprints, deep and uneven, some dragging slightly. There were scratches on the porch rails, fresh and raw. I realized I wasn't just imagining it. Someone or something had been there. The next day, I made a plan. I had a small .22 rifle with me, packed for emergencies, and a survival knife. I knew if someone approached again, I needed to be ready. I also packed extra water, food, and blankets into a bag, in case I needed to leave. I scouted the perimeter carefully, checking the trees, the surrounding trails, and even the stream behind the cabin. No sign of people, but the forest felt different. Every sound now carried weight. Every shadow was suspect. The fourth night was unbearable. It wasn't just scratching anymore. I heard voices, low and muffled, moving around the edge of the cabin, always outside the range of my flashlight. I could hear the faint crunch of dirt and leaves, the occasional thump of a boot. I stayed inside, lights off, curtains drawn, lying on the floor near the stove. I rationed my breath, tried to make myself small, invisible, like hiding from a predator. Hours passed. The dawn eventually arrived, faint and gray. The noises had stopped, but I didn't dare leave immediately. When I finally stepped outside, the prints were gone, but there were other signs. Broken branches, trampled grass, even some marks that looked like attempts to force the cabin door. By now, I was beyond fear. I was hyper alert, constantly scanning, constantly planning. I could no longer treat this as a vacation. The forest had turned into a trap. I reinforced doors with boards, moved furniture in front of windows, and carved notches into nearby trees to mark safe paths. My food and water were now double-checked for tampering. Every step outside the cabin became a calculated risk. Days later, I noticed something that made my blood run colder. The stream behind the cabin, which I had walked along every day, had something washed up along the bank. Discarded items, clothing, a backpack, possibly from a previous visitor. There was no human settlement nearby, so whoever or whatever had been around the cabin wasn't isolated. They had likely been following people who came here alone. It became clear I wasn't just alone. I was being watched, tracked, and tested. That realization changed everything. I no longer explored. I no longer left the cabin except when absolutely necessary. I rationed my food, saved water, and spent hours every day observing the forest, trying to spot movement, to detect patterns. Nights became a test of endurance. I slept in shifts, 20 minutes here, half an hour there, always listening. I set makeshift alarms using cans and string around the cabin perimeter, but I knew these were only temporary solutions. The final night of the ordeal, the presence became undeniable. I heard heavy breathing outside, deliberate and slow. There was no mistaking it. Someone was right there, at the edge of the porch, perhaps peering in through the window. I gripped my rifle tightly, loaded, ready. My heart was hammering, but my body felt focused, like I had trained for this moment. I watched the shadows move, trying to detect shape, form, anything to give away my adversary. Hours passed. The figure didn't advance, didn't retreat. It was a standoff, and I realized the best weapon was patience. At dawn, I saw a vehicle approaching on the main dirt road. An actual vehicle, not just movement in the forest. Relief flooded me as it came into view. A Ranger truck, marked clearly with emergency lights. I waved frantically, tears in my eyes. I had been planning this trip for months. The idea of spending a week alone in the mountains, away from everything and everyone, had seemed exciting, a chance to disconnect completely and breathe. I had chosen a remote cabin, miles away from the nearest town, nestled deep in the forest, accessible only by a narrow, winding dirt road that turned into nothing more than a rough trail at the last stretch. The map I had printed out was barely legible, and I had been warned by the rental agency that cell reception was minimal, if not completely non-existent. That had been part of the appeal. No notifications, no calls, no disturbances, just me and the quiet wilderness. The drive had been long, more exhausting than I expected. The sun was high when I finally reached the trailhead, and the narrow dirt road ahead was lined with dense trees, the shadows moving oddly with the slight sway of the branches. My car crawled along the uneven path, the tires crunching over loose stones and dried leaves. Each bend revealed a denser wall of trees, and I began to notice how silent it had become. Even the birds were few, and the wind had a strange, hollow whistle as it passed through the trees. By the time I reached the final stretch, I was gripping the steering wheel tightly, trying not to notice how isolated I truly was. The last half-mile was little more than a narrow track, rutted with roots, making my small car groan with every bump. When I saw the cabin, a small wooden structure tucked between two massive pine trees on a slight incline, relief washed over me. It looked exactly like the photos. Rustic, weathered wood, a small porch with a railing, a chimney rising from the roof. A stack of firewood was neatly piled against one side, and a few logs were scattered around the clearing, as if someone had been using the area for firewood collection. I parked and stepped out, stretching, feeling the cool mountain air brush against my face. The forest seemed endless, stretching beyond the clearing in every direction. I noticed that the cabin sat at the edge of a slight drop, a small creek below that glimmered in the sunlight. I carried my backpack, filled with supplies, and the small cooler with food, and walked up to the cabin, my boots crunching against dry pine needles. The first thing I did was inspect the cabin. The door creaked when I opened it, and I was greeted by the smell of old wood and a faint, musty odor. It was small inside, barely enough for a living space, a small kitchenette, and a single room with a bed against the far wall. A wood-burning stove sat in the corner, and there were shelves filled with basic supplies: canned goods, matches, and a few tools. I set down my bags and began unpacking, making the place feel a little like home. I stacked firewood near the stove, checked that my flashlight and lanterns were working, and organized my supplies so I could move freely without tripping over anything. As the sun began to dip below the tree line, shadows stretched across the clearing, and I noticed how still everything had become. The air was quiet, but not peaceful. It was the kind of quiet that pressed in on you, the kind that makes every small sound seem magnified. A branch snapped somewhere in the woods, and I froze, listening. The sound came again, and I realized it was probably just an animal. Deer, perhaps, or a fox. I reminded myself that being on edge was normal here. This was what I had come for, solitude, and part of that solitude was the awareness of being utterly alone. I decided to start a fire. The stove had a small glass window, and watching the flames flicker made me feel safer. The fire crackled, the sound oddly comforting, filling the cabin with warmth. I had brought a notebook and began jotting down my thoughts, the silence allowing me to focus entirely. Outside, the forest was growing darker, and I could hear the faint rush of the creek below. I fell asleep that first night feeling tired, yet oddly alert, like my senses had sharpened simply from the isolation. The following day, I explored the area around the cabin. There was a small trail that followed the creek, lined with moss-covered rocks and fallen branches. The trail was narrow, winding, and sometimes disappeared into the underbrush, forcing me to push through the thick foliage. I kept my backpack light, carrying only water, snacks, and my map. The forest was beautiful in a raw, unkempt way, and I marveled at the quiet majesty of it. Birds called from above, and I saw a few squirrels darting between the trees, but there were no signs of other humans. The deeper I walked, the more isolated I felt. I had imagined that the cabin was remote, but walking these trails, I realized how disconnected it really was. No sounds of cars, no voices, not even the distant hum of electricity. On the third day, something strange began to unsettle me. It started as a feeling, a subtle tension I couldn't shake. I noticed footprints outside the cabin, not human ones exactly, but prints that were oddly deep and irregular, pressed into the soft earth. I had walked around the clearing multiple times, and these prints hadn't been there before. They led into the woods, away from the cabin, then disappeared. I told myself it was probably an animal, maybe a large deer or a wild boar, but the prints seemed too heavy, too deliberate, like something had been pacing. I tried to ignore it, focusing on gathering firewood and cooking my meals, but the unease lingered. That night, the wind picked up. It was unusually strong, rattling the cabin and whistling through the trees. I was in bed when I heard it, the faint, deliberate crunching of leaves and sticks. I froze, holding my breath, listening. The sound came closer, stopping occasionally as if whoever or whatever it was moving carefully, deliberately around the cabin. My heart started pounding, and I clutched the flashlight. I didn't move at first, just waited, straining my ears. The sound eventually faded into the distance, and I tried to calm myself, convincing myself it was just the wind playing tricks, maybe an animal moving around. The next day, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Every time I stepped outside, I scanned the trees, the brush, the clearing. Something didn't feel right. When I went to gather more firewood, I found more prints, this time closer to the cabin, circling the clearing. They didn't look human, yet they didn't look entirely animal either. My mind kept going to worst-case scenarios. Someone could be following me. Someone could be hiding in the woods. The rational part of me told myself that this was impossible. Who would be out here in a cabin this far removed from civilization with no roads nearby? And yet, the instinctual fear wouldn't go away. I decided to take precautions. I secured the doors, wedged heavy furniture against them, stacked wood by the windowsills so any attempt to break in would be noisy. I kept my knife close and my flashlight ready. That night, I barely slept, lying awake listening to the sounds of the forest, the wind, and the occasional snap of a branch. Every little noise made me tense, my mind racing with possibilities, imagining someone moving silently just outside. The following morning, I discovered something that made my blood run cold. The back door, which I had double-checked before bed, was slightly ajar. I had locked it, I was certain. I inspected the cabin, every corner, every window. Nothing else seemed disturbed, but the feeling of violation was overwhelming. Someone had been here while I slept. My mind went through every possibility, every logical explanation, but there was none that made sense. I was alone out here, or so I thought. I realized I had to get help, but I had no cell reception. No one knew exactly where I was. Panic clawed at me, but I forced myself to stay calm. I packed my essentials, filled my water bottles, and decided to hike back to the nearest road, where I might get a signal or find someone. The hike back was tense, every step measured. I stayed on the trail, moving as quietly as possible, ears straining for the slightest sound behind me. I felt eyes on me constantly, shadows moving in the periphery. Hours passed, the sun beginning to dip behind the mountains again. The forest seemed different, more threatening. I kept checking behind me, my heartbeat hammering. The prints were there again, crisscrossing the trail, but I kept moving, refusing to look directly at them for too long. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, I reached the point where the trail met a rough dirt road. Relief surged through me. I ran the last few hundred meters, waving my arms, hoping for any passing car. Eventually, a truck came down the road. The driver, a local, stopped when he saw me. I explained in short bursts, pointing back toward the cabin. He looked concerned but didn't ask questions. He radioed for the authorities and agreed to take me back to the nearest town while they investigated. I kept looking back at the forest, still tense, still aware that I was lucky to be alive. When I saw the authorities later at the cabin, I learned that the tracks were indeed human. Someone had been living rough in the woods nearby, watching the cabin, following anyone who came there. They had left signs, traps, and evidence of stalking that suggested they had done this before. I had been planning this trip for months, a solo retreat to a remote cabin tucked deep in the woods of northern Maine. The appeal was simple: isolation, silence, and the ability to disappear from the weight of the world for a while. I had been burnt out at work for over a year, and the stress had begun to eat at me in ways I couldn't ignore. I needed to be away, completely away, somewhere I couldn't hear the hum of electricity or the chatter of people. The cabin was small, rustic, and completely off-grid. No running water, no electricity, just a wood stove, a small propane lantern, and a creek that ran nearby. The pictures online had made it look peaceful, almost charming. I had a map, a GPS, and a week's worth of supplies packed in my old hiking backpack. I told myself I was ready. The drive there was long and uneventful. I left in the morning, driving through winding roads flanked by thick pine forests, sunlight occasionally breaking through the canopy and casting mottled shadows on the pavement. The GPS guided me past tiny towns, old gas stations, and stretches of road where the trees met so closely that it felt like driving through a tunnel of green. The air became sharper as I drove further north, cooler and fresher than anything in the city. By late afternoon, I found the small, almost hidden dirt path that led to the cabin. The entrance was unmarked, barely a trail, and I had to slow down to avoid scraping the underbrush. My first thought was how utterly silent it was, the kind of quiet that pressed against your ears and made every little sound. My car crunching on gravel, leaves rustling, suddenly amplified. The cabin itself was smaller than I had imagined. A simple wooden structure with a slanted roof, a tiny porch, and windows that were clouded with years of dust and grime. There was a small pile of firewood stacked beside the porch, and a metal bucket with a few old tools inside. I parked and unloaded my bag, my boots crunching against the gravel. The door creaked as I opened it, the smell of wood and damp earth greeting me immediately. Inside, the cabin was sparse but functional. A small wooden table and 2 chairs sat near the window. A cot with a thin mattress leaned against the far wall. The fireplace was in the corner, surrounded by a scattering of ashes and half-burned logs. The floorboards groaned slightly under my weight, and the walls had a rough, unpolished texture, stained with age. I set my backpack down and began organizing my supplies. I had brought canned food, a small camping stove, bottled water, and a few books to pass the time. I lit the lantern and placed it on the table, the soft yellow light filling the room and pushing back the shadows in the corners. Outside, the sun was dipping below the treetops, and the forest began to darken in a way that felt immediate, like someone had pulled a curtain over the world. I went outside to gather some firewood for the night, the cool evening air biting at my cheeks. The forest was quiet, but not peaceful. There was a presence to it, something in the way the trees loomed and the shadows shifted. I reminded myself that it was just nature, nothing more. Night fell faster than I expected. I built a small fire in the fireplace, the wood crackling and sending sparks upward, and I ate a simple dinner of canned beans heated on the stove. After eating, I sat on the cot, my back against the wall, listening. At first, there was only the fire and the occasional call of a distant owl. But as darkness fully settled, other sounds began to emerge. The forest outside was alive in a subtle way, branches scraping against each other, leaves falling, the distant sound of something large moving through underbrush. My mind tried to rationalize it. Deer, raccoons, the wind. But the noises were closer, sharper, deliberate in a way that made my stomach tighten. I tried to sleep, but it was impossible. The sounds of the forest seemed to grow louder, punctuated by moments of complete silence that made me tense, expecting something to happen. Around midnight, I heard the first unmistakable sound. Footsteps outside the cabin. Heavy, deliberate steps on the gravel near the porch. My heart stopped. I froze, straining to listen. The steps stopped, and for a long moment, there was nothing. Then, slowly, a scratching sound began at the door, like someone was testing it. My body felt rooted to the spot. I reminded myself there was probably a lost hiker, or maybe an animal trying to get in. Still, the sound continued, soft but insistent. My hand shook as I reached for the small axe I had brought for emergencies. Every instinct screamed at me to stay silent, not to move, not to breathe too loudly. Minutes stretched into what felt like hours. I could hear the person or animal moving around the perimeter of the cabin. At one point, I thought I saw a shadow pass by the window. I debated calling 911, but I realized the area had almost no reception. Even if I could get a signal, the operator would likely have no idea where I was. The nearest town was over 30 miles away. My mind raced with possibilities, each more frightening than the last. I decided that if someone tried to force the door, I would defend myself with the axe and then run into the woods, using the darkness as cover. But I also knew the woods were treacherous, filled with roots and uneven ground that could easily break an ankle in the dark. Hours passed, and the sounds eventually faded, leaving only the occasional rustle of leaves. I never saw anyone, but I did not sleep. I stayed awake by the fire, axe in hand, every nerve on edge. As dawn approached, the tension eased slightly. I opened the door to check outside. There were no footprints in the gravel, no sign that anyone had been there. The forest looked calm in the soft morning light, almost peaceful, but my mind knew better. I gathered my courage and decided to explore the area around the cabin, to see if there was any evidence of what had been there. I walked through the trees, sticking to paths I could see in the morning light. I found nothing unusual, no tracks, no signs of an intruder. Only the forest, indifferent and endless. The next few days passed in a blur of tension and hyper-awareness. Every sound made me jump. Every shadow seemed to move with intent. I tried to distract myself with tasks, gathering firewood, cleaning the cabin, reading. But the feeling of being watched never left me. On the third day, I noticed something strange. A small branch, broken and placed against a tree near the edge of the clearing. It was not natural, and the deliberate placement unsettled me. I moved it, thinking perhaps it was nothing, but the unease lingered. That night, I heard footsteps again, this time further away, circling the cabin. It was not continuous, but intermittent, like someone pacing. The scratching on the door returned briefly, and I gripped the axe again, waiting. By the 5th day, I realized I could not stay. The fear had begun to wear on me physically. My appetite decreased, my sleep was non-existent, and my muscles were tense from constant vigilance. I packed my essentials, deciding I would leave at first light. That night, I slept fitfully, not because I felt safe, but because exhaustion finally overcame fear. When morning came, I gathered my pack and set off down the dirt trail. The forest seemed calm, the sun warm on my back, but I did not relax. Every snap of a twig, every bird call, set my nerves on edge. I kept moving, walking quickly, listening constantly. After a few miles, I reached a clearing where I could see the main road, and eventually, a passing car. I waved until it stopped. The driver looked at me strangely, but I ignored them, grateful for any sign of human contact. I got a ride back to town, each mile leaving the forest further behind, each passing second easing the tension that had built up inside me. In town, I reported the strange occurrences to the local ranger station, explaining the footprints, the noises, and the sense of being watched. They were skeptical, saying the area was remote and wildlife was abundant, that most visitors experienced heightened senses in the isolation. I nodded, understanding logically, but knowing that the fear I felt was real, tangible. It was not ghosts or myths. It was the reality of being alone, vulnerable, and exposed in a place where nothing could intervene if something went wrong. A few weeks later, I returned to the city. Life resumed its pace, but I noticed a shift in myself. I was more alert, more careful, more aware of the vulnerability that had been drilled into me during those nights in the cabin. The experience had been terrifying, yes, but it had also taught me something invaluable. The importance of preparation, the fragility of safety, and the strength that comes from facing fear head-on. I never went back to that cabin, and I doubt I ever will. But the memory is vivid, a constant reminder that the world is larger and more indifferent than we often imagine, and that sometimes the scariest things are not the supernatural, but the very real dangers of isolation and exposure. I kept a journal of the trip, detailing every sound, every sensation, and every